The air in Paris had a certain chill that evening. It wasn't the typical autumn bite, but something deeper, a cold that seeped into the bones. Below the bustling city streets lay a labyrinth, a world few dared to enter, the Paris catacombs. What began as a solution to the overflowing cemetery centuries ago had become a place of mystery and, for some, fear. Beneath the cobblestones, millions of skeletal remains rested in neat stacks, but the deeper one ventured, the more unsettling the place became. Marcus had heard the stories, the whispered tales of explorers who never returned, the strange occurrences deep in the tunnels. He wasn't one to scare easily, though. He had seen his fair share of strange things while exploring abandoned buildings around Europe, and nothing had ever truly unnerved him. But there was something about the catacombs that felt different, something that gnawed at him, though he couldn't quite place it. Still, the pull was undeniable. Beside him, Clara and David checked their gear. Clara, the team's researcher, had spent months gathering information about the catacombs maps, legends, and accounts from others who had made the journey into the depths. David, the tech expert, fiddled with his camera, testing the night vision and audio equipment. They weren't amateurs. They had prepared meticulously. Yet there was an unspoken tension in the air between them, as if they all knew they were about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The entrance was innocuous enough, a rusted metal door hidden in an alleyway, just a few blocks from a busy cafe. As they stepped inside, the noise of the city vanished, swallowed by the echoing silence of the tunnels. The walls seemed to close in almost immediately, their damp surfaces reflecting the faint glow of their headlamps. The narrow passage was just wide enough for them to walk single file, forcing them into a line that felt unnervingly vulnerable. As they descended, the air grew thicker, cooler. The city above faded further with every step, replaced by the oppressive weight of the earth pressing down on them. The first few chambers were filled with neatly stacked bones, arranged in patterns that were almost artistic. It was strange, standing among the dead like this, but it didn't feel threatening. Not yet. Clara moved ahead, her eyes scanning the walls, searching for markings she had read about. "This is where most tourists stop," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might disturb something. "They never go deeper than this." Marcus nodded, glancing at the map she had provided. It was old, drawn by someone who had ventured far beyond the usual paths. "We're not tourists," he muttered. They had a destination, a section of the catacombs rumored to be unexplored, untouched by modern visitors. Clara had uncovered references to it in obscure historical texts, vague mentions of chambers hidden beneath the known pathways. And it was this curiosity, this need to uncover the unknown, that had driven them to take on this dangerous journey. They pressed on, the tunnels becoming narrower, more uneven. The neat rows of bones disappeared, replaced by jagged rock and crumbling mortar. Here, the tunnels were less maintained. The passageways, feeling more like nature, had slowly begun to reclaim them. The further they walked, the quieter it became. Their footsteps seemed to echo too loudly, as though they were disturbing a silence that had existed for centuries. The deeper they went, the more unsettling it became. At first, it was subtle, the faint sound of dripping water, the occasional shift of loose stones beneath their feet. But soon, Clara began to slow her pace. "Did you hear that?" she asked, stopping abruptly. Marcus and David froze. "Hear what?" Marcus asked, his voice low. Clara turned, her expression difficult to read in the dim light. "I thought I heard footsteps." Marcus smirked. "Probably our own echoing. These tunnels can play tricks on you." But David shook his head. "No, it wasn't an echo," he said, his voice edged with concern. "It was behind us." They stood there for a moment, listening. The silence was deafening now, pressing in on them like the walls themselves were alive, waiting for something. Marcus brushed it off, urging them forward. Let's keep moving. We've got a long way to go. They continued deeper, the tension growing thicker with every step. The air felt heavier, harder to breathe, as if the tunnels themselves were trying to warn them to turn back. Clara kept glancing over her shoulder, her unease infectious. Even Marcus found himself gripping the flashlight a little tighter, his confidence beginning to waver. They had prepared for physical dangers, getting lost, cave-ins, or dehydration, but none of them had considered that something else might be down here with them. Hours seemed to blur together. The tunnels twisted and branched in ways the map hadn't shown, and soon Marcus realized they were off course. They stopped in a larger chamber to recalibrate. The walls were damp, and the floor was uneven, covered with debris from a long-forgotten collapse. David fiddled with the camera again, his hand shaking slightly. "I'm not getting a signal anymore," he muttered. Clara knelt by the wall, tracing a faded symbol with her fingers. "This shouldn't be here," she whispered. "This wasn't in any of the records I found." Marcus crouched beside her, shining his light on the symbol. It looked ancient, worn down by time, but its shape was still discernible, something that resembled an eye, or perhaps a gate. Whatever it was, it didn't belong here. He stood up, his pulse quickening. "Let's move. We need to get back on track." They pressed on, but the further they walked, the stranger things became. The tunnels seemed to shift, the air growing colder. At one point, Marcus stopped abruptly, staring into the darkness ahead. "Do you see that?" he whispered. Clara and David turned to where he was pointing, their lights sweeping across the tunnel. For a brief moment, something flickered, a shadow that didn't belong to any of them, moving swiftly out of sight. David cursed under his breath. "We're not alone down here." No one spoke after that. The silence became suffocating, punctuated only by the sound of their own breathing and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. They were far from where they had started now, deeper than any of them had intended to go. And in the distance, faint but undeniable, came the sound of footsteps. Not their own. The sound of footsteps echoed unnervingly through the tunnel, growing fainter and fainter, as if retreating into the very walls. The group stood frozen for a moment, not daring to speak, not even daring to breathe too loudly. It wasn't just the footsteps, it was the way they reverberated in the silence. Too distinct, too deliberate to be explained away by their own movements. There was something else down here. Marcus was the first to move, shining his flashlight toward the source of the sound. Nothing. Just an endless tunnel stretching into the dark, winding ahead like the throat of a sleeping beast. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach, but he couldn't let it show. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "If we stop now, we'll lose our bearings for good." David swallowed hard, but nodded, clutching his camera a little tighter. Clara hesitated, her eyes fixed on the shadows ahead, but she didn't argue. She knew as well as they all did that staying in one place down here was worse than moving forward, no matter what lay ahead. The group pressed on, but the sense of unease clung to them like a second skin. The further they went, the more the tunnels seemed to warp around them. The once familiar patterns of stacked bones and skeletal remains gave way to something more chaotic. Here, the walls seemed to twist unnaturally, the bones no longer arranged with care, but strewn haphazardly, as if thrown together by some unseen force. It was as though the catacombs themselves were rejecting their presence. As they walked, Clara found herself falling behind, her mind lost in the labyrinth of tunnels and flickering shadows. She kept hearing whispers, not the sound of voices, but something softer, more insidious, like the distant rustling of leaves or the fluttering of wings. She shook her head, trying to clear it. Focus. She had to focus. David, too, was struggling to maintain his composure. The camera felt heavier in his hands, and the tunnel seemed to press in on him, narrowing with every step. His breathing grew shallow, and he felt the unmistakable weight of being watched. It wasn't the darkness or the isolation that unnerved him. It was the sense that whatever was down here with them wasn't a lost soul or a forgotten spirit. It was something darker, something that had been waiting. They stopped at a crossroads where the tunnel branched in two different directions, both leading into yawning blackness. Clara unrolled the map and studied it in the beam of her headlamp. Her fingers trembled slightly as she traced their route. "We should be close to the chamber I found in the old records," she whispered, though her voice held little conviction. "If we keep to the left." Marcus nodded, glancing down the left tunnel. The air there seemed colder, thicker, as though it had been undisturbed for centuries. "Then that's where we'll go." But as they turned to make their way down the left tunnel, a sudden gust of wind swept through the corridor, an impossible thing. There was no breeze this deep underground. It was sharp, biting, and carried with it a smell of damp earth and something else. Something metallic. "Did you feel that?" David's voice was tight with alarm. Marcus nodded slowly. "Keep moving." The tunnel narrowed as they went deeper, forcing them to stoop slightly as the ceiling closed in on them. The walls were no longer lined with bones, but smooth stone, slick with moisture. The air was so thick it was hard to breathe, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step. Without warning, David stumbled, nearly dropping his camera. He cursed under his breath, reaching out to steady himself against the wall. His hand came away wet, slick with some dark, viscous substance that clung to his fingers. He wiped it off on his pants, his heart pounding in his chest. "Watch your step," Marcus muttered, though his own pulse was racing. His instincts were screaming at him that something was wrong, terribly wrong. But they had come too far to turn back now. Clara stopped suddenly, her light fixed on something ahead. "There," she said, her voice barely audible. At the far end of the tunnel was a doorway. Not just an opening in the rock, but a doorway made of carved stone, with intricate patterns etched into the surface. It didn't belong here. It was too deliberate, too out of place amidst the rough, natural caverns. This was what they had come for. They approached slowly, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The doorway loomed over them, imposing and ancient, as if it had been waiting for centuries to be discovered. Clara ran her hand over the carvings, her fingers tracing the strange symbols. She couldn't make sense of them. None of the research she had done had mentioned anything like this. It was as though they had stumbled upon something far older than the catacombs themselves. Marcus shone his light into the chamber beyond, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. The room was vast, the ceiling lost in shadow, and the walls lined with what looked like more bones. But these were different, arranged in chaotic patterns, spiraling upward like some twisted art installation. The sight sent a shiver down his spine. Clara stepped through the doorway, her eyes wide with wonder and fear. David followed, his camera capturing everything, though his hands were shaking. Marcus hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could feel it now, the malevolent presence that lurked just beyond the edge of the light. It wasn't a ghost or a spirit. It was something far worse. They had crossed a threshold. Whatever had been following them, whatever had been watching from the shadows, was no longer content to remain hidden. As they stepped into the chamber, the temperature plummeted, and the air grew impossibly thick. Marcus felt a sharp pain in his chest, like a hand squeezing his heart. He gasped, struggling to catch his breath. Then, all at once, the lights went out. Complete darkness swallowed them, thicker than any night they had ever known. The only sound was their own breathing, ragged and panicked. Marcus fumbled for his flashlight, but when he turned it on, it barely flickered, casting only a dim, sputtering light. Clara's headlamp was the same, its glow weak and failing. "Something's wrong with the gear," David whispered, his voice shaking. But before Marcus could respond, the darkness seemed to shift. Shapes moved in the shadows, just beyond the reach of their failing lights. A soft whisper echoed through the chamber, a voice, ancient and unintelligible, yet somehow familiar. It sent a chill down Marcus's spine. Then came the footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, closer. They weren't alone anymore. The footsteps echoed through the suffocating darkness, each slow, deliberate step sending a wave of dread through Marcus, Clara, and David. They were frozen, unable to speak, barely able to breathe as their eyes strained against the blackness. The lights from their flashlights and headlamps flickered weakly, casting only brief, sputtering glows as if the very air around them was devouring the light. Marcus clenched his fist tightly around the flashlight, his knuckles white. He wasn't one to panic, but the oppressive atmosphere in the chamber was suffocating. The walls felt as though they were closing in, and the footsteps, they weren't random. Whatever was making them was coming closer, with intent. "Do you hear that?" David's voice was barely a whisper, laced with fear. His camera hung limply at his side, forgotten for the moment. "It's right behind us." Clara didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes wide, darting from side to side as though she could catch a glimpse of the unseen figure in the dark. But there was nothing, only shifting shadows and that terrible, slow rhythm of steps. Then, as abruptly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. Silence pressed down on them, thicker and heavier than before. The chamber was impossibly still, the weight of centuries of secrets hanging in the air. Marcus' mind raced. Whatever was following them, it was watching now, waiting. "We have to keep moving," Marcus said, his voice tight with tension. He pointed the dim beam of his flashlight toward the far end of the chamber, where the walls seemed to curve into yet another tunnel. They hadn't come all this way to turn back now, not when they were so close to uncovering whatever lay hidden in the depths of the catacombs. Clara shook her head, but her legs moved almost mechanically, carrying her forward as though something else had taken hold of her. Marcus and David followed closely behind, their steps quiet, cautious. The tunnel ahead was narrow, the walls slick with moisture and covered in patches of crumbling stone. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something metallic and old. The deeper they went, the more disorienting the tunnel became. It twisted and turned in ways that didn't match the map Clara had studied so carefully. The walls seemed to shift, the ground uneven beneath their feet, as if the very structure of the catacombs was shifting around them, trapping them in a maze with no way out. David was the first to stumble. His foot caught on something, sending him crashing to the ground with a sharp grunt. "What the ma?" Marcus hurried to help him up, shining his light on the ground. Beneath David's foot lay a pile of bones, but these were different from the ones they had passed earlier. These weren't neatly arranged in the haunting displays the catacombs were known for. They were scattered, broken, as though something had disturbed them recently. David winced as he stood, brushing himself off. "This place is falling apart," he muttered, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. He glanced at the bones again, unease flickering in his eyes. "We need to get out of here," Clara said suddenly, her voice cracking. She looked back down the tunnel they had just come from, but the darkness was impenetrable now, as though the path behind them had simply disappeared. "This isn't right. None of this is right." Marcus agreed, though he didn't say it out loud. He couldn't let panic set in. "We're too far in. Let's find the next chamber," he said, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "Maybe we missed something." Clara didn't argue, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. They pressed on, moving faster now, as though the very walls were chasing them. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, the flickering light of their flashlights casting long, distorted shadows that twisted unnaturally against the stone. It was as if the catacombs themselves were alive, watching their every move. Then, up ahead, the tunnel opened into another chamber. But this one was different from the others. The walls were covered in strange carvings, symbols etched into the stone in patterns that Marcus couldn't recognize. They weren't like the historical markings or graffiti they had seen earlier. These were older, more deliberate, almost ritualistic. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, cracked and worn with age, surrounded by scattered bones and relics that had been untouched for centuries. Clara stepped forward, her eyes locked on the carvings. "This is it," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and terror. "This is what I was looking for." The air in the chamber was cold, colder than it had been in the tunnels, and it carried a sense of foreboding that settled deep in Marcus' chest. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and a creeping feeling of dread washed over him. Something was wrong. David raised his camera, but the moment he did, the lens cracked with a sharp snap. He cursed, lowering it quickly. "What the?" Before he could finish, a sudden, piercing sound echoed through the chamber, a high-pitched, inhuman wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sound cut through them like a knife, making Marcus' skin crawl. "What is that?" Clara gasped, stepping back toward Marcus. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Marcus couldn't answer. His heart raced in his chest as the wail grew louder, more deafening, until it became impossible to think. The sound wasn't coming from anything visible. There was no source, no explanation. It was as though the walls themselves were screaming, the catacombs finally revealing the horror that lay within them. "We have to go. Now!" Marcus shouted, grabbing Clara's arm and pulling her toward the tunnel they had just come from. But as they turned, they saw it. A figure, barely visible in the flickering light of their failing flashlights, stood at the far end of the chamber. It wasn't human, not anymore. Its form was twisted, shadowy, as though it was part of the darkness itself. Its eyes, if they could be called that, gleamed faintly, reflecting the light like some predatory animal. It didn't move, but the pressure in the air around them grew heavier, suffocating. The wail faded, replaced by the sound of ragged breathing close, too close. Marcus took a step back, his body trembling with fear he hadn't felt in years. His mind screamed for him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. Clara was paralyzed beside him, staring in horror at the figure as it slowly, impossibly, began to dissolve into the darkness. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. The silence that followed was worse than the noise had been. It was as though the world itself had stopped. Marcus felt the weight lift from his chest, but the terror remained. What was that? David's voice was a hoarse whisper, barely audible. "We need to leave," Clara said, her voice shaking as she took another step back. "Now." Marcus didn't argue. He knew, deep down, that whatever they had seen wasn't going to let them leave easily. Without another word, they turned and fled back into the tunnel, the chamber behind them disappearing into the blackness as quickly as it had appeared. And somewhere in the distance, the footsteps began again. The footsteps were relentless now, growing louder with every passing second, their cadence erratic yet purposeful. It was no longer the slow, measured rhythm they had heard before. It was faster, more urgent, as though whatever was chasing them was no longer content to watch from the shadows. Marcus led the way, his breathing ragged as they hurtled through the twisting tunnels. The cold, damp air burned in his lungs, and every step seemed to drive him deeper into the maze of bones and stone. Clara was just behind him, her hand gripping his arm as they ran, her wide eyes darting between the darkness ahead and the tunnel behind them, where the faint echoes of footsteps kept pace. David lagged slightly, the camera now forgotten in his desperate attempt to keep up. "We're going in circles." Clara's voice was a ragged gasp as they turned another corner, only to find a wall of skulls that looked far too familiar. She stumbled, nearly falling, but Marcus caught her by the arm and pulled her along. The map she'd been so careful to study was useless now. None of the paths made sense. Every tunnel they took seemed to lead them right back to where they had started, the twisted layout of the catacombs warping around them. Marcus didn't respond. He knew she was right, but the fear clawing at the back of his mind told him one thing: stopping was worse. They couldn't stop, not with whatever it was so close behind. David stumbled again, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. "We can't keep this up. We'll get lost for good," he panted. But even as he spoke, he knew they were already lost. The sound of the footsteps behind them grew louder, closer, now accompanied by something else. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was more like a low, guttural murmur, barely audible beneath the pounding of their hearts. The words, if they were words at all, were in a language none of them could understand, but the malevolence in the sound was unmistakable. It seemed to wrap around them, pulling at their sanity with invisible claws. "We have to find another way out." Marcus's voice cracked with desperation as they turned another corner, plunging deeper into the catacombs. His flashlight flickered again, the weak beam barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. He felt as though the air itself was turning against them, thickening around them, making every breath a struggle. Suddenly, Clara yanked on his arm, pulling him toward a narrow opening in the wall that they had almost passed. "Here!" she cried, her voice tight with fear. Without waiting for a response, she ducked through the opening, squeezing her way into a narrow side tunnel. Marcus followed, his shoulders brushing against the rough stone walls as he wedged himself into the passage. David was close behind, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he squeezed through the tight space. The tunnel was cramped and uneven, forcing them to hunch over as they moved, but the sound of the footsteps behind them faded slightly, muffled by the narrow walls. Marcus let out a shaky breath, but he knew better than to believe they were safe. Not yet. As they made their way through the tunnel, Clara slowed, her breathing heavy and erratic. "This isn't right," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "None of this is right. It's like the catacombs are alive. They're changing." Marcus glanced at her, his brow furrowed in confusion, but he didn't have the energy to argue. The thought had crossed his mind more than once, the way the tunnels seemed to twist and turn, leading them back to where they started, as though they were being toyed with by some unseen force. But he couldn't let himself believe that. There had to be a way out. There had to be. The tunnel abruptly opened into another chamber, much smaller than the others they had seen, but still lined with bones. These bones, however, were different. They were piled haphazardly in the center of the room, not arranged in the careful patterns they had come to expect. The sight was disturbing, as though someone or something had been here recently, rifling through the remains. Clara stepped forward cautiously, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room. "What is this place?" she whispered, but there was no answer. David, his face pale and glistening with sweat, leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath. "I don't care what it is," he muttered. "We need to keep moving." But before any of them could take another step, the murmuring sound returned, this time louder, more distinct. It was coming from somewhere deep within the catacombs, echoing off the walls, but it was impossible to tell from which direction. The words were still unintelligible, but the feeling they evoked was clear. Whatever was speaking was angry, furious. Then, without warning, the pile of bones in the center of the chamber shifted. Clara gasped, stumbling back as the bones began to move, slowly at first, as though being pushed by some unseen force. But then they moved faster, rattling and shifting, until they were swirling in a chaotic spiral. Marcus stepped back, his heart hammering in his chest as the bones rose into the air, twisting and turning in impossible directions. "What the hell is happening?" David cried, his voice breaking as he stared in horror at the spectacle before them. His flashlight flickered, then went out completely, plunging them into near-total darkness. Only Clara's headlamp remained, casting a weak, trembling light over the scene. The bones swirled faster now, forming a tornado of skulls and limbs that rattled against the walls. The murmuring grew louder, more insistent, as though it was commanding the bones to move, to rise, to become something more. Then, with a deafening crash, the bones collapsed back onto the floor, the sound reverberating through the chamber. The murmuring stopped, replaced by a tense, suffocating silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the ragged breathing of the group as they stared at the pile of bones, waiting for whatever had caused the disturbance to reveal itself. But nothing happened. "We need to get out of here," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "Now." Marcus didn't argue. He turned toward the tunnel they had come from, but something stopped him. A cold, creeping sensation crawled up his spine, and he knew, without looking, that they were no longer alone. Slowly, he turned back to the chamber, his eyes scanning the shadows. And there, at the far end of the room, something moved. It was just a shadow at first, barely discernible in the dim light. But then it stepped forward, revealing a figure cloaked in darkness. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. Its face was hidden, but its eyes, those eyes, gleamed in the faint light, piercing through the gloom with an eerie, predatory glow. The figure didn't move, but its presence was undeniable. The air around them seemed to thicken, and the temperature dropped even further, the cold biting into their skin. Marcus took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. "Run," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own fear. Clara didn't need to be told twice. She turned and fled toward the tunnel, her footsteps echoing in the narrow space. David followed, stumbling as he ran, his camera forgotten in his haste to escape. But Marcus hesitated, his eyes locked on the figure. There was something about it, something that told him this wasn't over, that even if they escaped this chamber, whatever was following them would still be there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for its moment. The figure tilted its head slightly, as though acknowledging his thoughts. Then, slowly, it began to move toward him. That was all it took. Marcus turned and ran, his heart pounding in his ears as he raced after Clara and David, the sound of his footsteps blending with the echo of the thing behind him. The catacombs weren't just a place anymore. They were alive, and they were angry. And they weren't going to let them leave without a fight. Marcus' footsteps echoed through the narrow tunnel as he raced forward, his mind a blur of panic and dread. Behind him, the ominous presence of the figure seemed to press closer, suffocating him with its cold, heavy aura. The catacombs had become a labyrinth of terror, each turn leading them deeper into the darkness. But running felt futile. No matter how fast or far they fled, the shadows always seemed to close in. Ahead, Clara's breath came in ragged gasps as she pushed herself forward, the dim glow of her headlamp flickering weakly in the oppressive blackness. David stumbled beside her, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with the same fear that gripped Marcus. The catacombs were no longer just a maze of bones and stone. They were something far more sinister, a force that had twisted reality into a living nightmare. "We can't keep going like this," David cried, his voice breaking through the deafening silence of the tunnels. "It's like we're running in circles." Marcus knew he was right. He had felt it too, the disorienting sensation that they were being led, funneled into some deeper, darker part of the catacombs where escape would be impossible. But what choice did they have? The thing chasing them wasn't going to stop, and neither could they. Up ahead, the tunnel split into two paths. Clara hesitated, glancing back at Marcus with wild eyes, silently begging for direction. But there was no way to know which way was right. The map had long since become useless, and the tunnels twisted and turned in ways that defied logic. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat dry with fear. "We'll take the left," he said, forcing the words out. It wasn't a choice based on reason, just instinct, a desperate hope that somehow it would lead them away from the nightmare pursuing them. Clara nodded, and without another word, they veered left, plunging into yet another narrow passageway. The air was colder here, the walls closing in tighter around them, and the silence that followed them was deafening. Marcus could still feel it, though the presence. It lingered just behind the veil of darkness, always watching, always waiting. The tunnel led them into a small chamber, one that seemed slightly different from the others they had passed through. The ceiling was lower here, the walls closer, and the arrangement of bones felt deliberate. Neat rows of skulls lined the walls, staring back at them with hollow, empty eyes, and the ground beneath their feet was slick with moisture. "We have to stop," Clara gasped, leaning against the wall, her body trembling with exhaustion. "Just for a minute. I can't keep going." Marcus hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to keep moving, but the look on Clara's face, pale, drenched in sweat, told him they couldn't push much further. They were nearing their limit. He glanced at David, who was hunched over, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. "All right," Marcus said, though his voice was tight with unease. "But just for a minute." They stood in the center of the chamber, the silence around them thick and oppressive. Marcus' flashlight flickered weakly, and he hit it against his palm, trying to coax more life from the failing batteries. The beam brightened for a moment, casting eerie shadows on the walls, but it wasn't enough to push back the overwhelming darkness that pressed in on all sides. Clara slid down to the floor, her back against the wall, pulling her knees to her chest. Her eyes darted around the chamber, never lingering too long on any one spot, as if she was afraid of what she might see if she stared too hard. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What's chasing us?" Marcus didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure there was an answer. Whatever it wasn't something he could explain with reason or logic. It wasn't just a ghost or an apparition. It was something older, darker, something tied to the very foundations of the catacombs themselves. The catacombs weren't just a burial site. They were a trap, a place where the past bled into the present, where the dead were never truly at rest. David, still catching his breath, sank down beside Clara. He was shaking, though he tried to hide it. "We can't stay here. It's going to find us." Marcus knew he was right. Whatever was hunting them, it wasn't far behind. And now they were trapped, backed into a corner in a chamber that felt more like a tomb with every passing second. Then, from the darkness of the tunnel they had come from, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The echo of each step sent a wave of dread through Marcus' body, and he stiffened, his muscles tensing as his heart pounded in his chest. "It's here," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the approaching footsteps. Marcus' mind raced. There was no other exit, no other tunnel to flee into. They were trapped, and whatever was coming for them was closing in fast. He could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on him, the air growing colder, thicker, with every step it took. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, just outside the chamber. For a long, agonizing moment, there was only silence. Then, a whisper of voice so soft and so low that Marcus could barely hear it, but he knew it was speaking to him, directly to him. It was the same murmuring voice they had heard before, but now it was clear, distinct. It wasn't speaking in a language Marcus recognized, but somehow he understood the meaning. It was calling them, calling him. "Come," it said, the word curling around him like a cold breath. "Come deeper." Marcus' pulse quickened, his mind screaming at him to resist, to fight. But something about the voice was seductive, pulling at him with a force he couldn't explain. His legs felt heavy, as though they were no longer under his control, and he took an involuntary step forward. "Marcus!" Clara's voice cut through the fog in his mind, sharp and desperate. She reached out and grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "What are you doing?" The spell broke, and Marcus stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He blinked, disoriented, the chamber spinning around him for a moment before he regained his senses. "We have to go," David said, his voice shaking as he stood, glancing nervously toward the tunnel. "Now." Marcus didn't argue this time. Without another word, he grabbed Clara's hand, pulling her to her feet, and together they ran toward the other end of the chamber. The walls seemed to close in around them as they moved, the catacombs twisting and warping in ways that defied logic. It felt like the tunnels themselves were trying to trap them, to drag them deeper into the darkness. Suddenly, Marcus stumbled, his foot catching on something buried beneath the dirt. He fell hard, his flashlight tumbling from his hand and skittering across the ground. Pain shot through his knee, but he gritted his teeth and pushed himself up, reaching for his flashlight. But as his fingers brushed the metal casing, something cold and sharp wrapped around his wrist. He gasped, jerking his hand back, but the grip tightened, pulling him down. Marcus' heart raced as he looked up, his eyes locking onto the source of the grip. A hand pale, skeletal, and impossibly strong was reaching out from the ground, its bony fingers wrapped tightly around his wrist. Marcus struggled, kicking and thrashing as he tried to free himself, but the hand pulled harder, dragging him closer to the ground. The dirt shifted beneath him, and Marcus realized with horror that more hands were emerging from the earth, their skeletal fingers grasping at his legs, his arms, pulling him down into the depths. "Help!" Marcus screamed, his voice raw with terror. Clara and David rushed to his side, grabbing his arms and pulling with all their strength. But the hands kept pulling, dragging him down into the darkness, their grip cold and unrelenting. For a moment, Marcus thought it was over. He could feel the ground opening up beneath him, pulling him into the catacombs' final, eternal embrace. But then, with one final, desperate tug, Clara and David yanked him free. The hands disappeared as quickly as they had come, leaving nothing but disturbed earth and a cold, hollow silence. Marcus lay on the ground, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. His body ached, and his mind reeled from the terror of what had just happened. But there was no time to recover. The presence, the thing that had been chasing them, was still there, waiting in the darkness. "Let's go," Clara said, her voice shaking as she helped Marcus to his feet. "We can't stay here." With trembling legs, Marcus stood, and together they fled deeper into the catacombs, the darkness closing in behind them. The whispers followed. Sarah Lockwood Winchester's life began in a way that gave no hints of the future she would eventually lead. Born in 1839 to a well-to-do family in New Haven, Connecticut, she was brought up in a world of privilege and opportunity. Her family was part of the upper class of New England, and she was afforded the best education available to women at the time. Sarah was said to be highly intelligent, fluent in several languages, and possessing a natural charm that made her a darling of high society. It seemed that she was destined for a prosperous and happy life. In 1862, at the age of 23, Sarah married William Wirt Winchester, the son of Oliver Winchester, the founder of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. At that time, the Winchester rifle was becoming one of the most successful firearms in the world, known for its efficiency and effectiveness. The company's success meant that Sarah and William were part of one of the wealthiest families in America. The couple seemed to have everything one could hope for: wealth, status, and a promising future. But tragedy would soon change the course of Sarah's life forever. Just 4 years into their marriage, in 1866, the couple was struck by a devastating loss. Their only child, Annie Pardee Winchester, was born but died only 6 weeks later from a rare childhood illness known as marasmus. This blow shattered Sarah. The joy of becoming a mother was cruelly taken from her, leaving a wound that would never fully heal. She withdrew from the public eye, sinking into deep sorrow. The pain didn't stop there. Over a decade later, in 1881, Sarah's husband William succumbed to tuberculosis, a disease that had claimed many lives during that time. Now, Sarah was not only grieving the loss of her child, but also the death of her beloved husband. These compounded losses left her in a state of despair, as she found herself alone in the world, burdened by unimaginable grief. Following William's death, Sarah inherited a fortune over $20 million, the equivalent of hundreds of millions in today's dollars, and 50% ownership of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, which provided her with an enormous daily income. But despite her vast wealth, Sarah could not escape the shadows of the past. This is where the story of the Winchester Mystery House begins to take a darker turn. Stricken with guilt and believing she was haunted by the spirits of those who had died from the very invention that made her family so rich, Sarah sought answers beyond the material world. Legend has it that she visited a medium in Boston who delivered a chilling message. The spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles were seeking revenge. According to the medium, these spirits were the cause of Sarah's misfortune, and they would continue to torment her unless she did something to appease them. The medium allegedly told Sarah that she needed to move west and build a house to appease these restless spirits. The catch was that construction on this house could never stop. If the building ever ceased, the spirits would come for her. Whether or not this story is entirely true remains a mystery, but what is known is that soon after the meeting with the medium, Sarah moved to California and purchased a small, unfinished farmhouse in the Santa Clara Valley. This house would eventually become the Winchester Mystery House. In 1886, Sarah began the construction that would never end. She hired teams of carpenters, stonemasons, and laborers to work around the clock, expanding the house into a sprawling, labyrinthine mansion. The construction followed no master plan, and the house grew in a seemingly haphazard fashion, with rooms added on top of rooms, staircases leading to nowhere, and doors opening to brick walls. What Sarah Winchester's true intentions were will likely never be fully understood. Some believe she was driven by her guilt, building room after room to confuse and contain the spirits that haunted her. Others speculate that she was simply a woman dealing with unbearable loss and grief, and that the constant construction was a way for her to stay busy, to keep her mind occupied. Still others think Sarah was simply eccentric and that the bizarre design of the house reflected her unique personality and imagination. Despite the rumors and speculation, Sarah Winchester remained a private figure throughout her life. She never gave interviews, and she rarely spoke about her personal beliefs or the reasons behind the constant construction. To her neighbors, she was an enigma, a wealthy widow who lived in seclusion in her ever-growing mansion, with only her staff and occasional visitors for company. The image of Sarah as a reclusive, grieving widow added to the growing legend surrounding her. Locals whispered about the strange goings-on at the mansion, and stories of hauntings began to circulate. People speculated that Sarah was trying to communicate with the dead, using the house as a kind of spiritual sanctuary. Others said she was building the house as a way to atone for her family's role in the deaths of so many. Whatever her reasons, one thing is clear. Sarah Winchester's life was shaped by loss, and her grief manifested in a way that would leave a lasting impact. The house she built stands as a testament to her pain, her fears, and perhaps her hope that in some way she could make peace with the spirits of the past. As the years rolled by, the Winchester Mansion, now known as the Winchester Mystery House, became a sprawling, bewildering maze of rooms, hallways, and staircases. With each passing day of construction, the house grew more perplexing and even more detached from any logical architectural structure. For those who visited or worked on the mansion, it was clear that this was no ordinary home. The unusual design choices reflected something deeper, something connected to the hidden fears and secrets that Sarah Winchester carried within her. To the casual observer, the house seemed like a bizarre creation, a place where the laws of design and reason simply did not apply. It was easy to get lost within its walls, as the layout made little sense. Long hallways stretched out in random directions, sometimes leading to a dead end or a closet. A staircase might rise for several steps, only to stop abruptly at a ceiling. Doors opened to brick walls, while some even opened to a sheer drop outside the house, with no balcony or landing. It was a place full of strange and unnerving surprises at every turn. But what was the reason for these odd architectural choices? The answer, if there was one, seemed to lie in Sarah Winchester's complex and mysterious relationship with the spirits she believed were haunting her. Some stories claimed that Sarah had designed the house as a way to confuse these spirits, hoping that the labyrinthine design would keep them from finding her. Others suggested that the house was never meant to be understood by the living at all, but instead built as a kind of spiritual puzzle for the dead. What became clear over time was that the house itself seemed to reflect Sarah's growing obsession with the supernatural. In the later years of her life, it was said that she often consulted mediums or even communicated directly with spirits to guide her in the construction process. She allegedly held nightly seances in a special room of the house, known as the Blue Room or the Seance Room, where she would attempt to commune with the spirits and receive their instructions on how to proceed with the building. The room was hidden away in the maze of the mansion, accessible only through secret passages, reinforcing the idea that Sarah was operating in a world that was not fully visible to others. The Blue Room itself was shrouded in mystery. Some accounts described it as a small, dimly lit chamber, with a single chair, a writing table, and a bell that Sarah would ring to summon the spirits. The windows were said to be covered with heavy curtains, and the room was always kept locked when not in use. Whether or not these seances were real or simply exaggerated by local legend, it is undeniable that Sarah's belief in the supernatural played a crucial role in shaping the house. She may have seen the spirits not just as vengeful beings, but as her advisors, helping her navigate her strange and solitary life. In addition to the house's baffling architecture, there were other oddities that hinted at Sarah's deeper beliefs. The number 13 appeared repeatedly throughout the mansion. Windows had 13 panes, staircases often had 13 steps, and even the bathrooms featured 13 tiles. Sarah's fascination with this number remains one of the more enduring mysteries of the house. Was it a superstition, a lucky number, or something more significant? Some believe that the number 13 was meant to ward off evil spirits or bring her protection, but Sarah never explained its meaning to anyone, leaving it up to speculation. There were also symbols embedded in the house's architecture that hinted at Sarah's interest in mysticism and the occult. Some believe she was influenced by esoteric teachings or ancient wisdom, possibly incorporating elements of numerology or spiritual symbolism into the house's design. The house itself became a kind of living talisman, full of hidden meanings that only Sarah truly understood. Aside from these symbolic elements, the house also featured cutting-edge technology for its time. Despite the bizarre layout, Sarah spared no expense when it came to modern amenities. The mansion was equipped with indoor plumbing, including hot water, which was a rare luxury in the late 19th century. It also had push-button gas lighting, an advanced intercom system, and even a unique heating system. These modern features stood in stark contrast to the house's chaotic design, creating a strange blend of the old and new. But as impressive as these features were, They only added to the house's mystique. For those who ventured inside, it felt less like a home and more like a puzzle waiting to be solved. The house was full of secret passageways and hidden doors, many of which led nowhere. Some believed these were designed to help Sarah move through the house unseen or to allow her to escape the spirits that might be following her. Others thought they were simply the product of her eccentric mind, her grief and guilt manifesting in the creation of this strange and haunting structure. The longer the house stood, the more stories began to emerge about its haunted nature. Visitors and workers alike claimed to have experienced strange occurrences within its walls. Some reported hearing footsteps when no one else was around. Others claimed to have seen shadowy figures moving through the hallways or disappearing into walls. The sound of hammering, even after construction had ceased following Sarah's death, was said to echo through the mansion. These ghostly rumors only fueled the legend surrounding the house, making it a destination for those curious about the supernatural. Sarah's isolation and secretive nature only added to the intrigue. She rarely spoke to outsiders, preferring to live alone in her vast mansion, surrounded by the constant noise of construction. Over time, she became known as the Mystery Lady, a widow who had retreated from society into her world of endless building and spiritual consultations. Some saw her as a tragic figure, a woman broken by grief and guilt, while others thought she might have been mentally unwell, driven by irrational fears and superstitions. The house itself became a reflection of Sarah's inner turmoil. The chaotic, nonsensical design was a physical manifestation of the confusion and sorrow that plagued her. For nearly 4 decades, she lived within its walls, overseeing the construction of a mansion that seemed destined never to be finished. And yet, for all its strangeness, the house was her sanctuary, the place where she could try, in her own way, to make peace with the ghosts of her past. The Winchester Mystery House grew into a living legend, a symbol of one woman's battle with forces both seen and unseen. The mysteries that surrounded its construction have never fully been explained, and the house itself continues to captivate and confuse those who visit it. To this day, the questions remain. Was Sarah Winchester truly haunted by the spirits of those who had fallen to the rifles that bore her name? Or was she simply haunted by her own grief, her own fears, building an endless house to distract herself from the loss that had consumed her? In either case, the house stands as a testament to a life marked by tragedy and a mind that sought to cope with it in the only way she knew how, by building endlessly until the day she could build no more. As the Winchester Mystery House continued its relentless expansion, Sarah Winchester's life grew increasingly isolated. Although she was one of the wealthiest women in America, she withdrew further and further from society, shutting herself away in her ever-growing mansion. She rarely ventured outside, and the few people who did encounter her described her as a somber, almost ghostly figure who seemed consumed by her private thoughts. This seclusion, combined with the mystery surrounding the house, only deepened the fascination with her and the stories of spirits that surrounded her life. By this time, Sarah had become known as a reclusive widow, a woman who lived in near total isolation, spending her days directing the construction of a house that seemed to have no end. Though she continued to employ a large staff of workers, carpenters, and servants, few knew her personally. She avoided social gatherings and seldom interacted with the community outside of her home. Even among her employees, Sarah was distant, communicating mostly through her foreman or leaving instructions for the workers without speaking to them directly. Those who worked on the house or visited for business purposes reported that Sarah was a kind, though deeply private, employer. She paid her workers generously, ensuring their loyalty and dedication, but they knew little of her beyond the fact that she insisted on the continual building of the mansion. This ongoing construction, regardless of the time of day or the scope of the additions, was a constant in Sarah's life. It was as if stopping, even for a moment, would open the door to the spiritual forces she feared. The growing complexity of the house mirrored the deepening complexity of Sarah's emotional and mental state. The more the mansion expanded, the more labyrinthine it became, and it was clear that the purpose of the construction was no longer practical, if it ever had been. The rooms, hallways, and staircases seemed to follow no logical pattern, as if they were not meant to serve any real human needs. Instead, they appeared to be designed for something or someone else. This endless, obsessive construction became a central part of Sarah's existence, an all-consuming project that kept her mind occupied as she navigated her grief and fear. But Sarah's isolation was not only physical, it was also emotional and psychological. The loss of her daughter Annie, followed by the death of her husband William, had left Sarah profoundly affected. Her wealth, though vast, could not shield her from the pain of those losses. Her retreat from society seemed to be both a way to protect herself from the outside world and a way to escape the guilt she felt about the fortune she had inherited, much of it earned from the Winchester rifles that had claimed so many lives. It's easy to see how Sarah's internal world mirrored the mansion she was building around her. Just as the house became a maze of dead ends, hidden passageways, and unexplained rooms, Sarah's own thoughts seemed to follow similarly confusing and tangled paths. The constant building was, in many ways, a reflection of her own attempts to construct a barrier between herself and the traumas of her past. But beyond the mansion's physical growth, there was another dimension to Sarah's isolation, her relationship with the supernatural. By now, it was widely believed that Sarah's fear of the spirits of those killed by the Winchester rifle drove much of her behavior. Whether these spirits were real or imagined, they had become a defining force in her life. The stories of Sarah holding nightly seances in the Blue Room became widely accepted as fact, even if no one outside her immediate circle ever witnessed them. It was said that Sarah used these seances to communicate with the spirits, seeking guidance on how to build the house in a way that would appease them. While these stories are shrouded in mystery and legend, there's no doubt that Sarah's belief in the spirits was genuine. She seemed to feel a responsibility for the deaths caused by the weapons that had made her family so wealthy, and in her mind, she needed to atone for this. The house, in its bizarre and sprawling design, was her way of making peace with these restless souls, or at least of keeping them at bay. Despite her isolation, Sarah was not entirely alone. She maintained a small, loyal staff who worked and lived in the house with her. Most notably, her niece, Marion Marriott, moved in with her and became one of the few people who had regular access to Sarah's private world. Marion's presence was a comfort to Sarah, offering her some form of human connection in her otherwise solitary existence. Still, even with Marion by her side, Sarah remained deeply withdrawn. A woman whose life had been shaped by loss, guilt, and a relentless fear of the unknown. Those who visited the house during this time often left with strange and unsettling stories. Some spoke of eerie feelings while inside, as if they were being watched. Others claimed to have heard footsteps or voices when no one else was around. The stories of the mansion being haunted began to spread far and wide, adding to the growing legend of both the house and its mysterious owner. The more isolated Sarah became, the more the stories about her grew, turning her into a figure of fascination and fear in the local community. But for Sarah, the isolation wasn't just about escaping from the world, it was about survival. The house, with its endless construction and confusing design, was her fortress against the spirits she believed were after her. She feared that if the building stopped, if the hammers and saws went silent, the spirits would finally catch up to her. In her mind, the ongoing construction was the only thing keeping her safe, the only thing holding back the supernatural forces that had plagued her since the deaths of her husband and child. As the years went on, Sarah's health began to decline. She became more frail and less able to oversee the construction of the house directly. Yet, even as her physical strength waned, Her obsession with the mansion continued. Workers still received orders from her, and the building process never ceased. Though she rarely left her bedroom in the later years of her life, Sarah remained deeply involved in every decision related to the house's design and expansion. Her seclusion, combined with her increasing frailty, only added to the sense of mystery surrounding her. To the outside world, Sarah Winchester was a woman trapped by her own grief and fears, locked away in a mansion that grew more bizarre with each passing year. The people of San Jose whispered about the mad widow who lived in her endless house, driven by ghosts and guilt to build and build, as if the construction itself could save her from the darkness that had consumed her life. Yet, to those few who knew her, Sarah was not mad. She was a woman who had experienced unimaginable loss and who had chosen to cope with it in the only way she knew how, by retreating into herself and into the strange, ever-changing mansion that she built around her. For Sarah, the Winchester Mystery House was more than just a home. It was a reflection of her soul, a place where she could try to find peace in a world that had offered her so much pain. But peace, it seemed, would always elude her. And as Sarah's life neared its end, the house stood as a testament to her isolation and the mysteries that had shaped her existence. What would happen to the mansion and the woman who had built it would soon become the final chapter in this story of loss, fear, and an unfinished legacy. In the early morning hours of September 5th, 1922, Sarah Winchester passed away in her sleep at the age of 83. Her death marked the end of nearly 4 decades of continual construction on the Winchester Mystery House. The woman who had isolated herself from the world, driven by grief, guilt, and a fear of the unknown, was gone. But the mansion she had built, the sprawling, labyrinthine structure that defied explanation, remained, standing as both a symbol of her life and a monument to the mysteries she carried with her to the grave. Sarah's passing sent ripples through the community. The locals, who had long whispered stories about the crazy widow and her haunted house, were now free to speculate on what would become of the massive estate. When the news broke that construction had finally stopped, many believed that the spirits who had driven Sarah to build incessantly had finally been appeased. With her death, they assumed, the haunting would end and the mansion would fall silent. But Sarah's legacy was far from over. In the days following her death, rumors and stories about the house continued to spread. What would become of the Winchester Mystery House was a question on everyone's mind. The mansion was not only an architectural marvel, but also a place shrouded in myth and legend. And now, without Sarah's guiding hand, the house itself seemed to take on a life of its own, as if it were still caught between the world of the living and the world of the spirits that had haunted her. The contents of Sarah's will revealed just how secretive she had been about her estate. Despite her vast fortune, she left no clear instructions regarding the future of the house. In fact, she left it out of her will entirely. Instead, her personal belongings and much of her wealth were bequeathed to her niece, Marion Marriott, and a few loyal employees. But the mansion, with its 160 rooms, twisting hallways, and hidden passageways, was left behind, its future uncertain. After Sarah's death, the mansion was thoroughly inspected for the first time by those outside her inner circle. What they found inside only deepened the mysteries surrounding the house. The sprawling structure contained a bewildering assortment of rooms, some of which had likely never been used. Rooms that were locked and hidden were opened for the first time in decades, revealing untouched furniture and decor from a bygone era. Visitors described it as walking through a time capsule, a snapshot of a life that had been suspended in perpetual construction. The sheer scale of the house was astonishing. Workers who had been inside for years had only seen small portions of it. But now, for the first time, the full extent of Sarah's creation was revealed. The mansion included 47 fireplaces, 10,000 window panes, 17 chimneys, 2,000 doors, and miles of hallways. But more than the numbers, it was the sheer strangeness of the design that captured people's attention. Trapdoors, false staircases, and rooms within rooms created an experience that was unlike anything else. The house seemed designed to confuse and disorient anyone who stepped inside. One of the most puzzling discoveries was the existence of entire wings of the house that had been sealed off. These areas, forgotten and left unfinished, added to the eerie atmosphere. It was as if Sarah had simply abandoned certain projects in mid-construction, locking the doors and moving on to other sections of the mansion. These sealed-off areas fueled speculation about Sarah's mental state in her later years. Had she grown too frail to oversee the construction? Or had the spirits, for some unknown reason, instructed her to leave these areas unfinished? The public's fascination with the house only grew after Sarah's death. Entrepreneurs saw an opportunity, and soon after, the mansion was opened to the public as a tourist attraction. It was quickly dubbed the Winchester Mystery House, and people flocked to see the bizarre structure for themselves. The stories of Sarah's nightly seances, her fear of the spirits, and her obsessive need to continue building made for a compelling narrative that drew in curious visitors. But for all the ghost stories and legends that surrounded the house, it was also a marvel of construction. Architects and engineers were both baffled and impressed by the mansion's design. Though much of it defied traditional logic, the craftsmanship and attention to detail were undeniable. The house was both a maze and a masterpiece, a physical manifestation of one woman's eccentricities and fears. Over the years, the stories about the house have evolved, and it has become a destination for paranormal enthusiasts who believe that Sarah's spirits still linger in the mansion. Countless visitors and paranormal investigators claim to have experienced strange occurrences while inside unexplained cold spots. The feeling of being watched, and even sightings of shadowy figures moving through the halls. The legend of the haunted Winchester Mystery House has grown, turning it into one of the most famous haunted houses in America. Yet for all the stories of hauntings and restless spirits, the house also stands as a testament to Sarah's life and the struggle she endured. Her grief, her guilt, and her fear of the unknown were woven into the very fabric of the mansion, and it is impossible to separate the structure from the woman who built it. The house, in all its confusion and chaos, was Sarah's way of coping with the tragedies that had marked her life. It was both her prison and her refuge, a place where she could hide from the world and from the spirits she believed were haunting her. Today, the Winchester Mystery House remains an enduring symbol of one woman's attempt to make sense of her own suffering. It is a place of intrigue and mystery, where visitors come to marvel at its strange architecture and to ponder the life of the woman who created it. The mansion, with its endless rooms and hidden passageways, continues to draw people in, much as it did during Sarah's lifetime. But even now, nearly a century after her death, the true meaning of the house and the full extent of Sarah's motivations remains elusive. For Sarah Winchester, the house was never just a building. It was a way to keep the spirits at bay, a way to make peace with the past, and perhaps a way to atone for the bloodshed caused by the rifles that bore her name. But in the end, the house became more than just a home. It became a symbol of loss, fear, and the lengths to which one woman was willing to go in order to protect herself from forces, both real and imagined. As visitors walk through the twisting hallways and climb the staircases that lead nowhere, they are not just exploring a mansion. They are stepping into the mind of Sarah Winchester, a woman who spent her life haunted by both the living and the dead. And in doing so, they become part of a legacy that continues to captivate, confuse, and mystify all who encounter it. The Winchester Mystery House, with its endless secrets and unanswered questions, will likely never reveal all of its mysteries. But perhaps that is the point. For Sarah Winchester, the house was not meant to be understood by the living. It was a place for the spirits, and for herself to find some semblance of peace in a world that had been marked by tragedy. And in its strange, unfinished state, the house continues to serve as a reminder of the mysteries that lie within us all. In the heart of St. Louis, Missouri, during the late 1800s, the Lemp family stood as one of the most prominent and prosperous dynasties in the region. The family's name was synonymous with success, luxury, and innovation. Their pride and joy, the Lemp Brewery, had grown to be one of the largest and most influential breweries in America, setting them apart as leaders in the booming beer industry. The Lemp family's ascent to fortune seemed unstoppable, and at the height of their wealth, they built what would become their most lasting legacy, the Lemp Mansion. It was in 1868 that Johann Adam Lemp, the patriarch of the family, laid the foundations for the brewery that would revolutionize the production and distribution of lager beer in the United States. His innovative techniques for brewing and preserving beer catapulted the Lemp name into national fame, with their product becoming a staple in saloons and homes across the country. Lemp's vision was bold and unwavering. His brewery quickly expanded, and soon, the Lemp family reaped the rewards of his ingenuity. The Lemp Mansion itself was a testament to the family's immense success. Constructed in the early 1860s, this grand, stately home overlooked the bustling streets of St. Louis. It wasn't merely a house, but a symbol of power, wealth, and dominance. With its sprawling rooms, luxurious furnishings, and cutting-edge architecture for the time, the mansion was designed to host high society gatherings, grand parties, and exclusive business meetings. For years, the Lemp family lived a life of opulence and grandeur within its walls. At the helm of this empire was William J. Lemp, Johann's son, who took over the family business following his father's death. Under William's leadership, the brewery soared to even greater heights. The mansion, too, expanded, growing to include secret tunnels leading to the brewery, a horse stable, and a state-of-the-art auditorium. The Lemps were the envy of St. Louis, their name attached to every major event and charity in town. The mansion thrived as a hub of business and social life, but there was something else brewing within the family, a darker force that no amount of wealth could stop. Beneath the surface of their gilded lives, there were cracks beginning to form, small and unnoticed by the public. The family's growing wealth came with pressures and burdens that weighed heavily on its members. William Lemp's tireless work ethic, which had pushed the brewery to unprecedented success, had also taken a toll on him and those around him. While the family continued to host lavish parties and entertain prominent figures in their mansion, behind the closed doors of their private rooms, they struggled with inner turmoil. William Lemp Jr., William Sr.'s son, who would later take over the business, was often seen as the heir to this mighty empire. However, even as a young man, William Jr. wrestled with the weight of the family's expectations. While the mansion was filled with laughter and music during its many social events, William Jr. often found himself wandering the halls in solitude, caught between his father's shadow and his own insecurities. By the late 19th century, the Lemp Brewery had become one of the largest in the country, but with success came even more challenges. Competitors began to rise, and the beer market grew fiercer. William Jr. knew that to maintain their dominance, the Lemp family would need to adapt, but the weight of running the brewery had already taken a toll on him. Inside the grand Lemp Mansion, the walls that had once echoed with joy and celebration now seemed to close in, with each family member feeling the strain of the life they led. It wasn't just business that caused the tension within the Lemp family. Their personal lives became more complex as well. Marriages were strained, and secrets began to seep into their once tightly knit circle. While the family presented an image of unity and strength to the world, cracks had begun to show, and those cracks, though small at first, would only widen with time. The mansion, once a symbol of their unshakable success, began to feel different. Some visitors reported feeling a strange unease within its walls, a coldness that hadn't been there before. Whispers of odd happenings in the mansion's many rooms began circulating among the household staff, and a heavy atmosphere seemed to settle over the home, though no one could quite place what was wrong. Despite the growing tensions, the Lemp family pressed on, maintaining their public image as best they could. The mansion continued to host extravagant parties, and the brewery, though facing more competition, remained a powerful force in the industry. Yet behind the scenes, the weight of the family's struggles, both personal and professional, was becoming harder to bear. The mansion, with its sprawling rooms and hidden corridors, seemed to take on a life of its own. Some believed that the mansion was beginning to reflect the family's inner turmoil. The servants whispered among themselves about seeing shadows that moved when no one was there, or hearing strange noises late at night. The atmosphere within the mansion grew darker, though outwardly the family remained as poised and powerful as ever. As the new century approached, the world around the Lemp family was changing, and so were they. The mansion, once the site of so much joy and celebration, had become a place of sorrow and secrets. Even those closest to the family could sense that something was amiss, though no one could quite explain it. For now, the Lemp family continued to hold on to their empire, and the mansion remained a symbol of their wealth and success. But beneath the surface, the cracks were widening, and it would not be long before the weight of their struggles became too much to bear. As the 20th century dawned, the Lemp family's fortune seemed more precarious than ever. Inside the mansion that had once symbolized their power and prestige, tensions simmered and began to surface. It was no longer just the brewing industry's growing competition that troubled the family. Personal struggles and unresolved conflicts weighed heavily on each of its members, causing fractures that would soon become irreparable. William Lemp Sr., who had inherited the empire from his father, was no longer the vibrant and dynamic leader he had once been. Though the Lemp brewery still operated with great success, William Sr. found himself increasingly burdened by the pressures of running a business in an ever-changing landscape. The death of his beloved son, Frederick, had shattered his resolve and left him reeling. Frederick, once seen as the future of the Lemp legacy, had died unexpectedly, and the loss had struck the family like a thunderclap. The emptiness left behind could not be filled by business success, and the mansion, which had once bustled with activity, now echoed with silence and grief. Frederick's passing marked the beginning of the family's tragic decline. William Sr., devastated by the loss, began to retreat further into himself. His once sharp business acumen dulled, and the brewery, which had been the pride of the Lemp family, began to suffer from his lack of leadership. The weight of his sorrow was felt by everyone in the mansion, where even the grandest rooms seemed to dim under the strain of his melancholy. William Jr., who had always felt the shadow of his father looming over him, now found himself thrust into the position of leading the family business. But where his father had once commanded respect and authority, William Jr. struggled to keep the brewery afloat. The booming industry that had once elevated the Lemp family to greatness was now crowded with fierce competitors, and William Jr. lacked the motivation and vision to innovate. Instead, he sought solace elsewhere, distracting himself from the pressures of leadership with a lavish lifestyle that further distanced him from the responsibilities he was supposed to inherit. The grand parties that had once filled the mansion with life continued, but they no longer carried the same sense of celebration. William Jr., known for his extravagant tastes and indulgences, turned the mansion into a place of excess. Behind the walls of the once revered estate, he hosted opulent gatherings, where the city's elite would drink and socialize long into the night. But these parties were not enough to mask the growing tensions within the family. The once thriving brewery was now in danger, and with each passing year, William Jr.'s grip on the business and his life grew weaker. The family's financial struggles soon mirrored their emotional ones. The weight of Frederick's death lingered, affecting not just William Sr., but his wife and surviving children. Relationships strained, with arguments erupting over the smallest matters, and whispers of secrets began to spread through the mansion. The grandeur of the Lemp estate became a prison for its inhabitants, and the walls that had once sheltered them from the outside world now seemed to close in, trapping them in their own misery. The brewery, once a symbol of progress and innovation, fell victim to poor management and bad investments. Prohibition was on the horizon, and the looming threat of a nationwide ban on alcohol only added to the family's anxiety. For a family that had built its legacy on the sale of beer, the future appeared bleak. As competition stiffened and the family's fortune dwindled, the Lemps faced the terrifying reality that their empire was crumbling. William Sr.'s health, both physical and mental, began to deteriorate. His once commanding presence in the mansion faded, and soon he was seen less frequently by the staff and family. The vibrant man who had built the Lemp dynasty from the ground up was now a shadow of his former self, withdrawing into the privacy of his mansion's hidden corridors. He spent his days secluded in his private quarters, rarely interacting with the outside world, and his decline cast a long shadow over the rest of the family. The mansion itself began to take on a different aura, one that reflected the inner turmoil of its residents. The once pristine halls felt darker, colder, as though the very air had thickened with sorrow. Servants who had once been proud to work in the prestigious Lemp all now whispered among themselves about strange happenings in the night footsteps where no one walked, voices in empty rooms, and an unsettling sense of being watched. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the mansion itself had absorbed the grief and despair of its inhabitants. As William Sr.'s isolation deepened, his son, William Jr., attempted to keep the brewery afloat, but the pressure was too much for him. He, too, began to unravel. His personal life, already marked by indulgence and excess, spiraled out of control. The strain of running a failing business, coupled with the family's mounting emotional burdens, became more than he could handle. Though he continued to host parties and maintain appearances, those closest to him could see that the weight of the Lemp legacy was crushing him. The Lemp mansion, once a symbol of the family's success and prosperity, now stood as a haunting reminder of what had been lost. The walls that had witnessed their rise to power now bore silent witness to their fall. It was no longer a home, but a relic of a fading dynasty, filled with memories that seemed to linger like ghosts in every room. And it was in those darkened halls, where grief, loss, and despair had taken root, that the first whispers of something more sinister began to surface. Visitors to the mansion, once eager to see the opulence of the Lemp estate, now reported feeling a heavy, oppressive presence as they walked through its rooms. Some spoke of hearing faint whispers, while others claimed to see fleeting shadows moving in the corners of their vision. The mansion that had once been alive with celebration was now eerily still, a place where the weight of the past could be felt in every corner. The Lemp family, once revered, had become a tragic tale whispered in St. Louis, a cautionary story of what happens when success turns to ruin. The mansion stood, a monument to their fall, and as the family's influence faded, the once glorious home became something else, entirely a place where memories of the past were not just remembered, but lived. The Lemp mansion, once a beacon of luxury and prosperity, now stood as a silent sentinel to the family's tragic history. After the passing of the last of the original Lemp heirs, the once vibrant home was largely abandoned, its grand rooms left to gather dust, the echoes of past laughter replaced by an eerie quiet. But it wasn't long before that quiet began to feel unnatural. Rumors of strange occurrences started to seep out from the few who remained near the mansion. At first, it was subtle, the sound of soft footsteps pacing through the empty halls, the occasional flicker of lights when no one was around, doors that seemed to close on their own. The mansion staff, those who had once served the Lemp family loyally, whispered among themselves about the unsettling events. But for a time, these occurrences were brushed aside as the natural creaks and groans of an old house. Yet, as the days turned into months, the phenomena became harder to ignore. The first major event occurred one stormy night. A caretaker, who had been hired to look after the mansion in its abandonment, was alone in the house when he heard the unmistakable sound of a piano playing. Startled, he made his way to the parlor, where the grand piano had been left untouched for years. As he entered the room, the music abruptly stopped, and he found the piano's lid wide open, keys still vibrating from the pressure of invisible fingers. He quickly left the room, convinced he had simply imagined it. But the next morning, the piano's keys were found pressed down in a strange, deliberate pattern, as though someone or something had been playing in the dead of night. Word spread quickly about the strange occurrences, and soon after, more reports began to emerge. Visitors to the mansion, including those drawn to its eerie history, would describe feeling an inexplicable chill as they stepped through the front doors. Some claimed to feel a sudden, overwhelming sadness, as though the very air inside the mansion was heavy with despair. But the most disturbing reports came from those who ventured into the basement, an area of the house that had long been associated with dark rumors. The basement of the Lemp mansion had always carried an air of mystery. During the height of the brewery's success, it had housed storage rooms and tunnels that connected the mansion to the brewery. But as the family's fortunes fell, so too did the use of these spaces, and they were largely abandoned. Those brave enough to explore the basement spoke of hearing disembodied whispers in the dark and the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. Several even claimed to see fleeting figures in the shadows, figures that would disappear the moment they were approached. One particularly unsettling encounter involved a group of paranormal enthusiasts who had been granted permission to investigate the mansion. They spent hours exploring the upper floors without incident, but as soon as they descended into the basement, their equipment began to malfunction. Cameras that had been working perfectly minutes earlier shut off unexpectedly, and their audio recorders picked up strange, low voices that none of them had heard at the time. One investigator, after standing alone in a corner for several minutes, suddenly felt a cold hand brush against her arm, though no one else was near her. Terrified, the group quickly left the basement, but when they reviewed their footage later, they discovered several seconds of static, followed by the faint sound of laughter that none of them could explain. The most disturbing part of the mansion, however, was not the basement or even the grand rooms upstairs. It was a small, unremarkable room tucked away on the second floor. This room, often referred to as the servants' quarters, was where many claimed to feel the strongest presence. Those who entered the room would often report feeling lightheaded or dizzy. On more than one occasion, visitors claimed they could hear the sound of someone weeping softly, though the room was empty. As more people visited the Lemp mansion, stories of hauntings began to pile up. Shadows that moved of their own accord, objects that disappeared and reappeared in different locations, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched became common experiences for those who spent time in the mansion. While some skeptics dismissed these stories as nothing more than overactive imaginations, others insisted that something unexplainable was happening within the walls of the mansion. Local paranormal investigators were soon drawn to the Lemp mansion, eager to uncover the truth behind the hauntings. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence came from an investigation conducted by a well-known ghost hunting team. After spending several nights in the mansion, they captured what appeared to be a figure standing at the end of a hallway. The figure was dressed in period clothing and seemed to vanish as the camera approached. The team, though seasoned in dealing with such phenomena, was stunned by the clarity of the apparition, and the footage quickly made its rounds through paranormal circles, cementing the mansion's reputation as one of the most haunted locations in America. But while investigators came and went, the strange happenings continued. Guests who stayed overnight in the mansion's converted bed and breakfast reported waking up to the sound of someone knocking on their door, only to find no one outside. Others described feeling pressure on the bed, as though someone had sat down beside them while they slept. The once grand home had become a place of restless spirits, unable or unwilling to leave the site of their past. Yet, for all the reports of ghostly encounters, there was one apparition that seemed to appear more frequently than any other. A man in a dark suit, often seen standing near the mansion's grand staircase. Those who saw him described a tall, imposing figure, his face obscured in shadow, who would disappear the moment anyone tried to approach. Some believed this to be the spirit of William Lemp Sr., forever tied to the home that had both made and destroyed his family. As the hauntings grew in frequency, the legend of the Lemp Mansion spread far beyond the borders of St. Louis. It became a destination for those fascinated by the paranormal, a place where people went not just to learn about the Lemp family's tragic history, but to experience the otherworldly for themselves. And though many left the mansion with stories of strange occurrences, few could explain what was truly happening within its walls. The mansion had become more than just a relic of the past. It had become a living embodiment of the family's legacy, haunted not only by the spirits of those who once lived there, but by the weight of their history. The Lemp family may have fallen, but their presence in the mansion remained, lingering in the shadows, waiting for the next person to stumble upon their story. With stories of eerie encounters and strange happenings surrounding the Lemp Mansion, it wasn't long before paranormal investigators and curious skeptics flocked to the grand old house. What began as whispered rumors among locals had become a national sensation, and those with a thirst for the supernatural sought to uncover the truth behind the hauntings. One of the first major investigations into the Lemp Mansion was conducted by a renowned team of paranormal experts. Equipped with state-of-the-art technology, they set out to capture evidence of the spirits said to roam the mansion's halls. Cameras were set up in every room, voice recorders placed in dark corners, and infrared sensors lined the hallways in an attempt to detect anything out of the ordinary. For the investigators, the goal was not just to prove the mansion was haunted, but to make contact with whatever or whoever was still there. On the first night of the investigation, the team gathered in the mansion's parlor. They sat in silence as the house creaked around them, the soft hum of their recording devices filling the stillness. After several hours of waiting, one of the investigators reported hearing a faint voice from the direction of the staircase. The team scrambled to check their equipment, and sure enough, the audio recorder had picked up what sounded like a soft whisper, a voice that seemed to say, "Why are you here?" Encouraged by this small piece of evidence, the team pressed on, moving room by room throughout the mansion. The second-floor bedroom, where guests had frequently reported the sensation of someone sitting on the bed, was of particular interest. As they set up their equipment, the air in the room grew noticeably colder. One of the investigators, who was sitting quietly on the edge of the bed, suddenly felt the mattress depress beside her, as though someone had sat down. She froze, glancing around at her team, but no one else had moved. What was that? She whispered, her voice shaking slightly. The others watched as a faint imprint remained in the mattress, visible even after she stood up. Cameras caught the entire event, and though they had no explanation for what had caused it, the team could not deny the experience was real. As the night wore on, the team continued to document strange occurrences. Footsteps were heard in the hallways, but when they rushed to check, no one was there. The motion sensors in the basement were triggered repeatedly, though the cameras showed only empty corridors. And in the servants' quarters, one investigator felt a sudden chill and described feeling a presence standing directly behind him, though when he turned, the room was empty. The basement, long considered one of the most unsettling parts of the mansion, proved to be a hotbed of activity. As they ventured into its depths, the investigators couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Several of them reported hearing low voices echoing through the narrow tunnels that once connected the mansion to the brewery. One particularly brave investigator stood alone in the basement for several minutes, only to hear what he described as the sound of heavy breathing coming from the far end of the room. When he called out, asking if anyone was there, the breathing stopped, but the sense of being watched lingered. The team returned to the mansion for several nights, hoping to gather more evidence. Each night, the activity seemed to increase. Disembodied voices, cold spots, and objects moving on their own became almost routine. But the most shocking moment came on their final night, when they attempted to make direct contact with the spirits through a series of questions. Using a device designed to pick up electromagnetic frequencies, the investigators asked if anyone was present and invited the spirit to make itself known. For several long moments, there was silence. Then, without warning, the device spiked, its lights flashing brightly as the needle jumped. The team looked at one another, excitement mixed with a growing sense of unease. They asked another question. "Are you one of the Lemp family?" The device remained still for a moment, then spiked again. The team pressed on, asking if the spirit had a message for them. This time, instead of a response from their equipment, they all heard a distinct knock coming from the far wall. They rushed to investigate, but once again, they found no one there. As word of these investigations spread, more and more paranormal enthusiasts descended on the Lemp Mansion, each hoping to capture their own piece of evidence. Some brought cutting-edge equipment, while others relied on nothing more than their instincts. Time and time again, those who entered the mansion came away with similar stories, strange noises, cold spots, and the overwhelming sense that they were not alone. One particularly striking piece of evidence came from a solo investigator who spent a night in the mansion's infamous second-floor bedroom. Armed with only a camera and a digital recorder, she sat on the edge of the bed, asking questions to the empty room. For hours, nothing happened. But as she reviewed the footage later, she noticed something chilling, what appeared to be a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, just out of focus. The figure didn't move, but it was clearly there, watching. Despite these numerous accounts, the most famous apparition tied to the Lemp Mansion remained the mysterious figure near the grand staircase. Several investigators and guests alike claimed to see him tall, dressed in a dark suit and standing still at the top of the stairs as though waiting for someone. Yet when approached, he would vanish. Some believed this to be the spirit of William Lemp Sr., tied forever to the mansion where his legacy had crumbled. As more and more evidence of the supernatural piled up, the Lemp Mansion's reputation as a haunted hotspot was cemented. It became not only a destination for paranormal investigators, but also for those simply curious about the house's dark history. Tours were offered, allowing visitors to walk through the mansion's eerie halls, and those brave enough could even stay the night, though few ever left without their own stories of strange encounters. Despite all the investigations, all the footage, and all the personal experiences, one question remained unanswered. Why were the spirits still there? Was it the tragic history of the Lemp family that bound them to the house, unable to move on? Or was the mansion itself, with its hidden rooms and dark corners, a beacon for the supernatural, drawing spirits from beyond? No one could say for certain, but those who stepped inside the mansion knew one thing: they were never truly alone. The Lemp Mansion, now infamous for its haunted history, had transformed into something far beyond a once grand family estate. Over the years, as more investigators, tourists, and thrill-seekers visited its halls, the mansion took on a new life as a paranormal landmark. It became a place where the past and the present seemed to intersect, where the line between history and the supernatural blurred, and where visitors came not only to witness its architecture, but to experience the inexplicable. In the years following the countless investigations and ghost hunts, The mansion's reputation as one of the most haunted places in America continued to grow. People from all over the country, and even the world, sought out the mansion, driven by a desire to connect with the spirits said to linger within its walls. Stories of ghost sightings, cold spots, strange noises, and objects moving on their own became almost commonplace, but they never lost their grip on the public's imagination. As the mansion's fame grew, so too did the fascination with the Lemp family itself. The tragic rise and fall of the Lemp dynasty became a central piece of American folklore, with the family's history serving as a cautionary tale of how great success can lead to immense suffering. Documentaries, books, and articles chronicling the family's story were produced, each one exploring the complex lives of the Lemps and the events that had ultimately led to the mansion's haunted reputation. Yet, for all the stories of paranormal activity, there was also a deep sense of sadness that seemed to linger over the house. Visitors often remarked that while the mansion was undoubtedly haunted, the spirits that resided there didn't feel malicious. Instead, many felt that the entities were lost or stuck, trapped in the home they had once cherished, but were now unable to leave. The tragedy of the Lemp family's downfall seemed to hang in the air, and many believed that the hauntings were not so much a sign of anger or resentment, but of unresolved pain. As the mansion became a popular attraction, it was also converted into a bed and breakfast, allowing guests to stay overnight and experience the house's eerie atmosphere for themselves. Those who spent the night often left with stories of strange occurrences, footsteps pacing in the hallways, the sensation of someone sitting on the edge of their bed, or the feeling of being watched while standing in front of the grand staircase. Some even claimed to have seen the now famous figure at the top of the stairs, a man in the dark suit, thought to be William Lemp Sr., keeping watch over the home he had once ruled. For many, staying at the Lemp mansion was an opportunity to confront the unknown. But while some arrived in hopes of a supernatural encounter, others were drawn by a different kind of curiosity, the desire to understand the complex legacy of the Lemp family. The mansion, in many ways, had become a monument to their history, a living museum where guests could walk through the very rooms that had once housed some of the most influential people in St. Louis. The grand dining room, the elegant parlors, the servants' quarters, each space was filled with artifacts of the past, reminding visitors of the lives that had been lived and lost within those walls. Though the mansion had undergone renovations over the years to accommodate guests, great care was taken to preserve its historical integrity. The rooms were restored to reflect the time when the Lemps had lived there, giving visitors a glimpse into the opulence of their world. Yet, even with these efforts, the house maintained its unsettling aura. The weight of the past was ever present, and guests often reported feeling an inexplicable sadness, as though the walls themselves remembered the pain that had been endured within them. As the Lemp mansion became more integrated into local and national culture, it also became a part of St. Louis folklore. Locals, who had grown up hearing stories of the mansion's haunted past, often shared their own experiences, adding to the growing list of supernatural events associated with the house. Some believed that the hauntings were tied to specific members of the Lemp family, while others thought that the house itself had become a kind of portal, attracting spirits from beyond. The mansion's presence in popular culture was cemented when it became the subject of numerous television shows and paranormal documentaries. Each program delved into the house's rich history, exploring both the family's tragic legacy and the mysterious events that continued to occur there. For many, these shows were the first glimpse into the world of the Lemp mansion, and they helped fuel a new wave of interest in the house, bringing even more visitors to its doors. Despite its transformation into a tourist destination, the Lemp mansion never lost its sense of mystery. Even those who had spent years studying the house, whether as historians, paranormal investigators, or curious visitors, agreed that there was something about the mansion that defied explanation. The stories of ghostly encounters and strange happenings were consistent yet elusive, leaving more questions than answers. The spirits, it seemed, were content to remain just out of reach, revealing themselves only in fleeting moments. Over time, the mansion became a symbol not just of the Lemp family's downfall, but of the enduring presence of the past. It was a place where history refused to stay buried, where the echoes of old tragedies continued to resonate. For many, this was the true legacy of the Lemp mansion, a reminder that even in the face of immense success, there can be deep and lasting sorrow. Yet, despite the house's haunted reputation, the Lemp mansion remained a place where people sought connection. Whether it was with the spirits that roamed its halls or with the history that shaped its walls, visitors continued to come year after year, drawn by the inexplicable pull of the mansion. Some came for the thrill of a supernatural encounter, while others came to pay their respects to a family whose story had become legend. In the end, the Lemp mansion was more than just a haunted house. It was a living testament to the resilience of memory, a place where the past refused to fade. And for those who walked through its doors, it was a reminder that the line between this world and the next might be thinner than we think. As visitors continue to flock to the Lemp mansion, they do so with the knowledge that they are stepping into a space that holds more than just history. The spirits of the Lemp family may still linger, but their presence is not one of fear, it is one of remembrance. The mansion, in all its haunted glory, stands as a bridge between the past and the present, a place where the story is never truly over. New Orleans, with its vibrant culture and rich history, has long been a city filled with intrigue. The French Quarter, in particular, stands as a testament to centuries of human experience, both glorious and grim. Amidst the colorful streets and lively jazz clubs, there exists a house unlike any other, the infamous Lalaurie Mansion. Its elegant facade hides a story steeped in tragedy, suffering, and a legacy that has haunted the city for nearly 2 centuries. Madame Delphine Lalaurie, born Marie Delphine McCarty in 1787, grew up in a world of privilege. She was part of New Orleans high society, and from an early age, she understood the importance of appearances. Her beauty, charm, and social standing made her one of the most admired women in the city. She was married 3 times, each union increasing her wealth and status. But it was her 3rd marriage, to Dr. Leonard Louis Lalaurie, that would cement her place in the city's dark history. The couple resided at 1140 Royal Street, a grand mansion in the heart of the French Quarter. The house, with its tall windows, iron lace balconies, and stately appearance, was the perfect setting for Delphine's lavish social gatherings. To the outside world, she was the epitome of refinement, hosting elegant parties that attracted the city's elite. Guests marveled at her grace, her wealth, and the beauty of her home. Yet, behind this polished exterior, something far more sinister was happening within the walls of the mansion. From the early days of her residency, rumors swirled about Madame Lalaurie's treatment of those enslaved in her household. While many wealthy families in New Orleans kept enslaved workers, there was something unsettling about the way Delphine interacted with them. Neighbors noticed strange, disturbing incidents, people whispering about how her staff seemed to disappear, never to be seen again. It was said that Madame Lalaurie had an uncharacteristically cold and distant demeanor towards them, a stark contrast to the warmth she showed her high society peers. One story that circulated involved a young girl who had worked in the house. She had been seen brushing Delphine's hair on the balcony one afternoon. Allegedly, the girl made a mistake, tugging too hard at a tangle. Madame Lalaurie, enraged, chased her through the house and onto the rooftop. The young girl, in her fear, leapt to escape Delphine's wrath, falling to her tragic end. It was an incident that should have triggered public outrage, but instead, it was quietly covered up, thanks to Lalaurie's wealth and influence. Over time, other accounts began to emerge. Some spoke of faint cries coming from the mansion late at night, while others claimed they saw strange figures peering from the windows as if pleading for help. Still, Madame Lalaurie's social standing remained intact. Wealth, power, and status allowed her to hide the unspeakable acts that were happening within her home. Dr. Lalaurie, a man of medicine, seemed indifferent to his wife's behavior. Though he was present in the mansion, he often absented himself from the household affairs, spending more time in his practice or indulging in the social privileges of the era. While his presence could have been a moderating influence on his wife, there were rumors that he, too, turned a blind eye to the growing darkness within their home. Madame Lalaurie was careful, ensuring that her public image remained flawless. She continued to host elaborate parties, where the most influential people in New Orleans would gather in her grand ballroom, sipping fine wine, unaware or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge the sinister reality hidden behind the mansion's closed doors. Yet the cracks in this perfect facade were growing harder to ignore. People began whispering more openly about her cruelty. But it wasn't until a tragic event in 1834 that the full extent of the horror within the mansion would be revealed. An accident in the kitchen, a fire that quickly spread, would bring everything to light. As the fire raged through the lower levels of the mansion, passers-by rushed to help. It was during this chaos that the full truth of Delphine Lalaurie's life came to the surface. The firefighters who responded to the blaze discovered something unimaginable, an attic full of unspeakable suffering. This discovery would forever change the legacy of the Lalaurie mansion. Madame Lalaurie, once admired for her beauty and charm, was now reviled. The mansion, which had once been a symbol of wealth and elegance, would forever be stained by the horrors that had occurred within its walls. The building itself seemed to absorb the cruelty, its once pristine appearance now a reminder of the darkness that lingered there. After the fire, the truth spread rapidly through the city. The socialite, once revered, was now despised. Crowds gathered in outrage outside her mansion, demanding justice for the atrocities discovered within. But before they could take any action, Delphine Lalaurie vanished, slipping away into the night, never to face justice for her actions. She fled New Orleans, leaving behind a legacy of cruelty that would forever haunt the city. The Lalaurie mansion, scarred by its history, was left to stand as a reminder of the dark deeds that had taken place within. Over the years, it would be sold and resold, with each new owner finding themselves unable to live comfortably within its walls. The mansion had become something more than just a house. It had become a symbol of the city's most tragic chapter, a place where the echoes of the past continued to linger. The events of April 10, 1834, marked a turning point for the city of New Orleans. A fire broke out in the kitchen of the Grand Lalaurie mansion, sending thick plumes of smoke into the sky. Neighbors rushed to help, fearing for the safety of Madame Delphine Lalaurie and her family. As they approached the house, what began as a simple act of concern quickly spiraled into a moment that would shock the city to its core. The fire, though dangerous, was not the main story. It was what the fire revealed that would leave an indelible scar on the history of New Orleans. As firefighters battled the flames, they discovered a locked room on the top floor, an attic that was previously hidden from view. Desperate cries from inside the house led them to force open the door. What they found would horrify even the most hardened among them. The attic was not merely a storage space, but a chamber of unimaginable suffering. Within its dark and claustrophobic walls, a group of enslaved people had been confined, their bodies weakened and scarred from prolonged mistreatment. The air inside the room was thick with the stench of neglect, and the conditions were far worse than anyone could have imagined. Many of them were in a state of malnourishment, with signs of severe physical harm. The most harrowing discovery, however, was the apparatuses and tools that had been used to inflict pain. The evidence of intentional harm was undeniable makeshift restraints, chains, and devices that had no place in a household. It became clear that this was not a result of simple mistreatment, but something far more deliberate and cruel. Witnesses described the scene in hushed tones for years to come. The trauma they encountered was so intense that many struggled to find words to fully capture what they had seen. Those who had previously dismissed rumors about Madame Lalaury's behavior could no longer turn a blind eye. The truth had been laid bare, and it was more horrific than anyone could have imagined. Madame Lalaury, once a celebrated socialite, had harbored a darker side that had remained hidden for far too long. As the fire raged below, she attempted to maintain her composure, denying any knowledge of the atrocities uncovered in her home. But the evidence was overwhelming, and word spread quickly through the city. The genteel mask that she had worn for years was shattered in an instant. As the news of the discovery reached the streets, a wave of outrage swept through New Orleans. People who had once attended Lalaury's lavish parties were now among the crowds demanding justice. The story of her cruelty spread like wildfire, and soon a mob gathered outside the mansion, their anger palpable. They called for her to be held accountable, but Madame Lalaury, ever calculating, managed to flee the scene before she could face the wrath of the public. In the days following the fire, the Lalaury mansion became a symbol of horror, a place where unspeakable suffering had taken place. It was said that the cries of those who had been harmed could still be heard within its walls, echoing through the now abandoned house. The building itself seemed to take on a life of its own, as if it had absorbed the pain and anguish that had occurred within. The authorities launched an investigation, but the damage had already been done. The full extent of Madame Lalaury's actions could never be fully documented, as many of the enslaved people who had suffered under her care did not survive to tell their stories. For those who had been found alive, their recovery would be a long and painful process. The city grappled with the aftermath, struggling to come to terms with the fact that such cruelty had been happening right under their noses. Dr. Leonard Louis Lalaury, her husband, had been absent during the fire, and there were conflicting reports about his involvement in the horrors that took place in the attic. Some claimed that he was complicit, turning a blind eye to his wife's actions, while others believed he was unaware of the full extent of her cruelty. Regardless of his role, the Lalaury name was now synonymous with suffering, and both husband and wife vanished into obscurity, leaving behind only speculation about their fates. The city, meanwhile, had to contend with the aftermath. The mansion, now abandoned, stood as a reminder of the horrors that had taken place. Neighbors avoided the building, unwilling to go near the place that had become a symbol of such intense suffering. It was said that strange noises could be heard at night, faint whispers, the sound of footsteps and cries that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. Those who were brave enough to approach the mansion reported an overwhelming feeling of unease, as if the building itself was alive with the memories of what had occurred there. Over time, the Lalaury mansion became more than just a physical structure. It became a dark legend, a story passed down through generations about the dangers of unchecked cruelty. The people of New Orleans, who had once celebrated the Lalaury family, now spoke of them only in whispers, as if even mentioning their name might invite some dark force into their lives. For years after the fire, the mansion stood empty, its windows dark and its walls decaying. No one dared to live there, and it became a place of ghost stories and urban legends. People claimed to see figures in the windows, shadows that would disappear when approached, and lights that flickered at night, despite the house being uninhabited. As the years passed, the house became a site of fascination for those interested in the supernatural. Paranormal investigators, curious tourists, and even thrill-seekers flocked to the mansion, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ghosts that were said to haunt its halls. The house had taken on a life of its own, its dark history forever tied to the legend of Madame Lalaury. But beneath the ghost stories and the sensational headlines, The true horror of the Lalaurie mansion remained rooted in the very real suffering of those who had been harmed there. Their voices, silenced for so long, were finally being heard, though only through the dark legacy of the building where they had lived and died. The Lalaurie mansion was no longer just a house. It was a testament to the horrors that humans could inflict upon one another. And though Madame Lalaurie had escaped justice in her lifetime, the echoes of her cruelty would continue to reverberate through the city of New Orleans for generations to come. When the Lalaurie mansion fell silent after the events of 1834, the once vibrant home now stood as a monument to human suffering. The horrors unearthed in the attic haunted the streets of New Orleans, and the city's residents grappled with the magnitude of what had occurred behind the mansion's elegant facade. Madame Delphine Lalaurie had vanished into the night, her name forever tarnished, but the scar she left behind remained deep and festering. In the weeks and months that followed the fire, rumors circulated about Madame Lalaurie's fate. Some believed she had fled to France, returning to the homeland of her ancestors to live out the rest of her days in exile. Others speculated that she had assumed a new identity and was hiding somewhere in the American South, far from the public eye. There were even whispers that she had met an untimely end, punished by some divine force for her unspeakable actions. But none of these rumors were ever confirmed. The truth about Delphine Lalaurie's final years remains one of the many mysteries surrounding her legacy. What was certain, however, was the immediate aftermath of the mansion itself. Once the flames were extinguished and the full extent of the suffering within its walls was revealed, the Lalaurie mansion became a place of infamy. The house, with its graceful architecture and prime location on Royal Street, should have been a coveted property, but its dark history cast a long shadow. No one wanted to live there. It was said that the very walls were tainted, that they had absorbed the cries of those who had suffered and could never be cleansed. The mansion stood empty for many years, its windows boarded up and its grand facade slowly deteriorating. Neighbors avoided walking past it, and the building became a source of superstitions. People claimed to hear strange noises coming from within the walls, muffled voices, eerie footsteps, and the unmistakable sound of sobbing. Even in the daylight, the mansion exuded an atmosphere of dread. It was as if the house itself was mourning the lives that had been lost within its walls. Over time, stories of a curse began to take hold. The house, some said, had been cursed by the souls of those who had suffered there. They believed that the spirits of the enslaved people who had endured unimaginable pain at the hands of Madame Lalaurie were still trapped within the mansion, unable to find peace. Visitors and passers-by reported seeing shadowy figures in the windows, even though the house was uninhabited. Others claimed to hear faint whispers, as if the spirits were crying out for justice that had never been delivered. As the legend of the curse grew, so did the mansion's reputation as a place of paranormal activity. In a city as steeped in supernatural lore as New Orleans, the Lalaurie mansion quickly became one of its most notorious haunted locations. It was said that those who dared to enter the house would feel an overwhelming sense of sorrow, a weight pressing down on them as they walked through its dark, empty halls. Some claimed to have seen the ghost of Madame Lalaurie herself, still wandering the mansion, forever bound to the place where she had caused so much suffering. Despite the fear that surrounded the mansion, it did not remain abandoned forever. The property changed hands several times over the years, with each new owner hoping to restore the building to its former glory. But no one stayed for long. Each time the house was sold, the new residents would quickly abandon it, citing strange occurrences and an oppressive, unsettling energy that made living there unbearable. Furniture would move on its own, doors would slam shut without warning, and cold spots would appear in rooms that had been warmed by the sun just moments before. The mansion seemed determined to drive away anyone who tried to make it their home. One of the most famous incidents occurred in the late 19th century, when the mansion was purchased by a wealthy businessman. Hoping to profit from the building's prime location, he turned the mansion into an apartment complex. But almost immediately, tenants began to report strange and disturbing experiences. Objects would disappear, only to reappear in bizarre places. Loud bangs and disembodied voices would wake them in the middle of the night. One tenant even claimed to have seen the ghostly figure of a woman dressed in an old-fashioned gown, standing at the foot of his bed. Needless to say, the apartment complex was not a success, and the building was once again abandoned. As the years passed, the mansion's reputation continued to grow. Stories of the hauntings attracted the attention of paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, and curious tourists alike. Some came hoping to catch a glimpse of the supernatural, while others were drawn by the dark history of Madame Lowry and the infamous attic where so much suffering had taken place. The mansion had become a macabre tourist attraction, a place where history and legend intertwined to create something both horrifying and fascinating. But beneath the sensational stories of hauntings and curses lay the true tragedy of the Lowry mansion, the suffering of those who had been harmed within its walls. Their voices, silenced by history, had been forgotten by many, overshadowed by the legend of the house itself. Yet the presence of their spirits, whether real or imagined, served as a reminder that the true horror of the Lowry mansion was not in the ghost stories, but in the very real human cruelty that had taken place there. In the decades after Madame Lowry's departure, the mansion became a symbol of the darker aspects of human nature. It was a reminder that even in the most beautiful places, there can be darkness hidden beneath the surface. The curse of the Lowry mansion, it seemed, was not just a supernatural affliction, but a reflection of the deep scars left by the cruelty that had been inflicted there. As the years turned into decades and then centuries, the Lowry mansion remained a focal point of intrigue and fear. Each new owner, whether skeptical or superstitious, could not escape the house's dark history. The building itself seemed to resist any attempt to erase its past, as if the very stones had absorbed the horror of what had taken place. And so, the legend of the Lowry mansion continued to grow, its place in the annals of New Orleans' haunted history cemented forever. Though the mansion still stands today, restored and preserved, it remains shrouded in mystery. Many believe that the spirits of those who suffered there are still trapped within its walls, unable to move on. The building's grand appearance belies the darkness that lingers inside, a reminder that some wounds can never truly heal, and some stories are too tragic to forget. As the years passed and the events of 1834 faded from living memory, the Lowry mansion slowly transitioned from a house of horrors to a site of fascination for those drawn to the mysterious and unexplained. New Orleans, a city already known for its deep connection to the supernatural, found in the Lowry mansion one of its most infamous landmarks. The mansion's dark history, entwined with tales of tragedy and cruelty, made it a magnet for ghost hunters, paranormal enthusiasts, and curious visitors from around the world. By the early 20th century, the mansion had changed hands numerous times, with each owner attempting, and inevitably failing, to restore the building to its former grandeur. The house, beautiful though it was, carried an unmistakable aura, an energy that made even the bravest of souls uneasy. Many owners found themselves facing more than just the challenge of restoring a historic property. They faced the mansion's reputation, and for some, the belief that the house was haunted proved to be too much. For decades, people reported strange happenings in and around the mansion. From unexplained noises to mysterious apparitions, the stories that emerged from the Lowry mansion seemed to confirm what many had long suspected, that the house had never truly been free of its tragic past. Reports of ghostly figures roaming the halls were common, and visitors often claimed to feel a deep, oppressive presence when they entered the house. One of the most frequently reported phenomena was the sighting of a woman believed to be Madame Delphine Lowry herself. Dressed in a period gown, Her figure was said to appear suddenly in various parts of the mansion, sometimes near the grand staircase, other times in the ballroom where she once entertained New Orleans' elite. Her presence, many believed, was not a comforting one. Those who claimed to have seen her often described an overwhelming sense of dread, as if they were in the presence of someone capable of unspeakable acts. Some visitors even reported feeling an inexplicable coldness whenever they approached the area where her ghost was said to appear. But it wasn't just Madame Lalaurie who was believed to haunt the mansion. Many believed that the spirits of the enslaved people who had suffered under her cruel hand were also still trapped within the walls of the house. The attic, where the most horrifying discoveries had been made, was the site of numerous paranormal experiences. Visitors reported hearing faint cries and whispers, as if the spirits of those who had endured so much pain were still calling out for help. Some even claimed to feel invisible hands brushing against them or pulling at their clothing, as though the spirits were trying to make contact with the living. Despite the growing number of paranormal reports, the Lalaurie Mansion continued to attract attention. Its status as one of the most haunted locations in New Orleans only increased its allure. Television shows, books, and documentaries exploring the mansion's dark past and ghostly activity brought even more attention to the already infamous house. Paranormal investigators flocked to the site, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. Some claimed to have recorded strange voices on their equipment, disembodied voices that seemed to cry out in pain or confusion. Others took photographs that showed unexplained shadows or eerie orbs of light hovering in the air. Over time, the Lalaurie Mansion became not just a place where history had been made, but a key location in the folklore of the city. Locals and tourists alike whispered about the house, trading stories of their own eerie encounters or tales they had heard from friends and family. The mansion had become more than just a physical building. It was a living legend, a place where the boundary between the past and the present, between the living and the dead, seemed to blur. For many, the mansion represented the darker side of New Orleans history. While the city was known for its vibrant culture, music, and festivals, the Lalaurie Mansion was a reminder that even the most beautiful places could hold dark secrets. The house, with its elegant architecture and prime location in the French Quarter, was a symbol of the extremes of wealth and power that had once defined New Orleans society. Yet beneath its beauty lay a history of cruelty, one that could never be fully erased. As paranormal activity around the mansion grew more notorious, so did the house's reputation as a dangerous place. Visitors who entered the mansion often described feelings of nausea, dizziness, or overwhelming sadness. Some even claimed that the mansion had a malevolent energy, that the spirits within were not simply restless, but angry, perhaps vengeful. Over the years, more extreme accounts emerged. People reported being physically harmed while inside the house, scratches appearing on their arms or legs, or even being shoved by unseen forces. These incidents only added to the legend of the mansion, making it seem like a place where the past continued to assert its power over the present. By the mid-20th century, the Lalaurie Mansion had become a fixture in New Orleans ghost tours. Guides would lead groups past the house, recounting its grisly history and the terrifying encounters that had taken place within. For many tourists, the Lalaurie Mansion was the highlight of their trip, an opportunity to get as close as possible to one of the most haunted locations in America. The house became an essential stop for anyone interested in the supernatural, and its dark reputation only grew with time. Yet for all the stories of hauntings and ghosts, there was also a deeper legacy at play. The Lalaurie Mansion, with its history of suffering, forced the city to confront a part of its past that was often overlooked. The cruelty inflicted upon the enslaved people who lived and worked in the mansion was not just an isolated incident, but part of a larger, darker history that had shaped New Orleans and the American South. The house, haunted though it may be, stood as a reminder of the human cost of greed, cruelty, and unchecked power. In recent years, the mansion has once again been restored, with new owners taking great care to preserve its historical significance. Yet despite the renovations, the aura of the house remains unchanged. Visitors continue to report strange occurrences, and the mansion's reputation as a haunted house remains as strong as ever. For many, the Lalaurie Mansion will always be more than just a historic building. It will remain a place where the past refuses to stay buried, where the spirits of those who suffered continue to make their presence known. Whether the Lalaurie Mansion is truly haunted or whether its reputation is the result of centuries of storytelling and fear, one thing is certain: the legacy of the house is deeply intertwined with the history of New Orleans. It is a place where the weight of the past is felt in every corner, where the walls seem to whisper of forgotten tragedies, and where the line between the living and the dead is as thin as the fog that often rolls in from the Mississippi River. In the 21st century, the Lalaurie Mansion stands as a paradox, a symbol of both history and legend, fact and myth, beauty and horror. The world may have moved on from the events of 1834, but the mansion itself remains a physical embodiment of those dark days, forever linked to its infamous past. Despite the modern renovations and the shifting landscape of New Orleans, the mansion continues to capture the public's imagination like few other places in America. Today, the Lalaurie Mansion is not just a historical landmark. It has become a cornerstone of popular culture, a setting for numerous films, television shows, and books, all exploring the darker corners of the human psyche. Whether portrayed in dramas, thrillers, or supernatural tales, the mansion's story is retold time and time again, each version adding a new layer to its already complex mythology. One of the most notable examples of this is its inclusion in American Horror Stories, where the mansion's history is fictionalized and reimagined for modern audiences, though always with an air of eerie realism that echoes the true horrors of its past. The fascination with the Lalaurie Mansion extends far beyond the borders of New Orleans. Ghost tours and paranormal investigations have been featured in documentaries and online content, drawing viewers who are captivated by the idea of a real-life haunted house. Every year, thousands of tourists flock to the city, eager to catch a glimpse of the place where history and the supernatural intertwine. Standing in front of the mansion's elegant facade, it's easy to forget that behind those walls, untold pain once occurred. And that's exactly what makes it so enticing for those intrigued by the macabre. For some, the Lalaurie Mansion is more than just a tourist attraction. It's a portal into the mysteries of the afterlife. Paranormal investigators have spent years documenting their findings, hoping to provide proof of what so many have claimed to experience firsthand. Some investigators enter the mansion armed with cutting-edge technology, thermal cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and voice recorders designed to capture sounds inaudible to the human ear. What they find often defies explanation. Shadows dart across empty rooms. Temperatures drop inexplicably, and strange, disembodied voices are captured on audio. Some investigators have even reported feeling physically touched by unseen hands, reinforcing the belief that the mansion is more than just haunted. It's alive with an otherworldly energy. Despite the numerous investigations, there has never been definitive proof that the mansion is haunted. Skeptics argue that the stories surrounding the house are nothing more than folklore, exaggerated by decades of retellings and the city's love for ghost stories. But for every skeptic, there is someone who has experienced something unexplainable, something that suggests that the mansion's dark. History has left an indelible mark on the present. One of the most perplexing mysteries surrounding the Lalaurie Mansion is the fate of Madame Delphine Lalaurie herself. While the general consensus is that she fled New Orleans after the fire, her exact whereabouts after her escape remains shrouded in mystery. Some believe she fled to France, living out her final years in anonymity, while others claim she never left Louisiana at all. There are even rumors that she returned to New Orleans in secret, blending into the city's society under a false identity. Although many have searched for definitive answers, none have been found, leaving her ultimate fate one of the mansion's most enduring mysteries. As for the mansion itself, its future seems just as uncertain as its past. Despite its renovations and modern use, there remains an undeniable sense that the house is still tied to the past, as though it cannot escape the horrors that once occurred within its walls. Those who live near the mansion often report strange happenings, lights flickering in the windows, unexplained sounds late at night, and an unsettling feeling that they are being watched. Even after all these years, the mansion continues to captivate and terrify in equal measure. The people of New Orleans, long accustomed to the city's rich tapestry of supernatural tales, often treat the Lalaurie mansion with a mixture of reverence and fear. For some, it's simply part of the city's history, a tragic chapter that reflects the darker aspects of humanity. For others, it's a warning, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and cruelty. And for many, it's a place to avoid altogether, a site too steeped in sorrow and suffering to be approached lightly. Yet for all the terror associated with the mansion, it has also become a place of reflection. In recent years, more attention has been paid to the true victims of the Lalaurie mansion, the enslaved men, women, and children who suffered at the hands of Madame Lalaurie. Their stories, long overshadowed by the legend of the mansion itself, are slowly being brought to the forefront. Exhibits and historical tours now make a concerted effort to honor the lives that were lost and to tell the fuller, more nuanced story of the mansion's past. In many ways, the Lalaurie mansion has come to represent the complexity of New Orleans itself, a city where beauty and tragedy often go hand in hand, and where the weight of history is felt in every corner. The mansion, with its grand architecture and dark legacy, stands as a testament to the city's resilience, but also as a reminder of the cruelty and suffering that once lurked behind its closed doors. It is both a symbol of the horrors of the past and a cautionary tale about the dangers of forgetting history. Even as the mansion continues to evolve, whether as a private residence, a tourist destination, or a historical landmark, it remains a place of unanswered questions. Is it truly haunted? Will the spirits that are said to inhabit its halls ever find peace? And will the true story of Madame Lalaurie's life and crimes ever be fully uncovered? The Lalaurie mansion, with its dark past and uncertain future, stands at the intersection of history and myth, a place where the lines between the living and the dead are forever blurred. And as long as it remains standing, it will continue to fascinate, terrify, and captivate those who dare to look beyond its elegant exterior and confront the chilling truths that lie within. The mansion's tale, though centuries old, is far from over. As new generations discover the story of Madame Lalaurie and her house of horrors, the legend will continue to grow, ensuring that the Lalaurie mansion remains one of the most haunting and mysterious locations in all of New Orleans, a place where the past never truly dies, and where the echoes of its dark history continue to reverberate through time. The story of the Stanley Hotel begins long before the first whispers of ghosts or strange occurrences were ever uttered. It starts with a man Freeland Oscar Stanley, whose vision of luxury and elegance would bring to life one of the most iconic hotels in the world, nestled in the rugged wilderness of Estes Park, Colorado. Freeland Oscar Stanley, born in 1849, was no ordinary businessman. Alongside his twin brother, Francis Edgar Stanley, he had already built a legacy, having invented the Stanley Steamer, a steam-powered automobile that brought them both wealth and fame. But by the early 1900s, Freeland's health began to deteriorate. He was diagnosed with tuberculosis, a common and often fatal illness at the time. Doctors advised him to seek out the fresh, clean air of the mountains to help improve his condition. Like many others in his situation, Stanley journeyed west in search of a cure. In 1903, Stanley and his wife, Flora, arrived in Estes Park, Colorado, and something about the place captivated him. The crisp mountain air and stunning views seemed to breathe new life into his weakened lungs. To his surprise and delight, his health improved drastically. Grateful for this transformation, Stanley envisioned turning Estes Park into a world-class tourist destination, one that would attract the wealthy and elite from across the country. But if he was going to bring the high society of America to the Rocky Mountains, they would need accommodations befitting their status. With that thought in mind, Stanley set to work building his dream, the Stanley Hotel. Construction on the Stanley Hotel began in 1907. Stanley spared no expense, importing materials from the East Coast and bringing in skilled craftsmen to build a structure that was as opulent as anything one might find in New York or Boston. This grand estate, perched at the foot of the mountains, would be a symbol of elegance in the heart of the untamed wilderness. The design of the hotel was influenced by colonial revival architecture, with a sweeping veranda that offered panoramic views of the surrounding mountains. Inside, it boasted modern amenities that were rare in this part of the country at the time, including electricity, telephones in every room, and bathrooms with running water. The hotel was a marvel of luxury, and when it opened its doors in 1909, it quickly became a hotspot for the rich and famous. Stanley and his wife were more than just the owners. They were hosts. Flora, a talented pianist, often played concerts in the grand music room, while Stanley personally welcomed guests and regaled them with stories. It was a place of joy, celebration, and escape, a retreat from the troubles of the world. But while the hotel thrived, there were already whispers that something wasn't quite right. Even in its earliest days, the Stanley Hotel was a place of contrasts, luxury surrounded by the raw beauty of nature, life thriving in the shadow of the mountains, and, as some would soon believe, the living sharing space was something else. The first reports of strange occurrences were subtle, easily dismissed by most. Guests would mention feeling uneasy in certain areas of the hotel, a chill in the air despite the warmth of the fireplaces, or the sensation of being watched when no one was there. These early stories were easy to brush aside. Old buildings creak, the wind whistles through the mountains, and people's imaginations run wild in unfamiliar places. At first, these small, unsettling moments were nothing more than the occasional whisper among guests and staff. But as the years passed, these stories grew in number and strangeness. One of the most famous events in the early history of the Stanley Hotel occurred in 1911. During a violent thunderstorm, the power went out, and the hotel staff scrambled to light lanterns to ensure the guests remained comfortable. Elizabeth Wilson, the hotel's head chambermaid, was tasked with lighting the gas lamps in room 217, one of the hotel's most luxurious suites. As Wilson entered the room, unaware that there was a gas leak, she struck a match, igniting a massive explosion that destroyed part of the second floor. Miraculously, Wilson survived the blast but was severely injured. After a long recovery, she returned to work at the hotel, continuing her duties until her eventual passing years later. Yet, it seems that Wilson's connection to the Stanley Hotel didn't end with her life. Soon after her death, guests began reporting strange occurrences in room 217. The bed covers would be neatly tucked when no one had entered the room. Luggage would be unpacked, and the lights would turn on and off on their own. Some guests even reported feeling a cool presence in the room, as if someone were standing beside them, watching over them. These events marked the beginning of what would become one of the most famous hauntings at the Stanley Hotel, and room 217 would go on to become a focal point of the hotel's eerie reputation. As the years went on, Stanley continued to pour his heart and soul into the hotel, and he remained closely tied to it until his death in 1940. But even death, it seems, couldn't keep him away. Guests and staff alike have reported seeing an elderly man resembling F.O. Stanley wandering the halls of the hotel, his figure often spotted in the lobby or near the hotel's bar. It's said that he still checks in on the place, ensuring that it runs smoothly as it did in life. Whether these sightings are the result of active imaginations or something more, the stories have persisted for decades. By the 1920s and 1930s, the Stanley Hotel had firmly established itself as a destination for those seeking the grandeur of the mountains without sacrificing comfort. Yet, alongside its reputation for elegance, it had begun to cultivate a darker mystique. Even in these early days, guests spoke of the strange energy that lingered in the hotel. Some reported hearing faint music playing from the ballroom late at night, despite the room being empty. Others claimed to see fleeting shadows moving through the hallways or the sound of footsteps echoing down the corridors when no one was there. But for all these oddities, the hotel continued to thrive. People came for the beauty of the mountains, the comfort of the hotel, and the stories that seemed to come to life within its walls. Whether they believed in the hauntings or not, the Stanley Hotel offered something that no other place could, an experience that lingered long after you left. And so, the seeds of the Stanley Hotel's haunted legacy were planted, growing alongside its reputation as a destination for the rich and famous. As the years passed, the reputation of the Stanley Hotel grew, not only as a luxurious mountain retreat, but also as a place where the past seemed to linger in unsettling ways. The early whispers of strange sensations and eerie feelings soon gave way to more concrete accounts, stories of ghostly encounters that couldn't be easily explained. And as with all great tales, the more these stories spread, the more they grew. By the mid-20th century, the hotel had become known not just for its elegance, but for the ghost that seemed to walk its halls. Of all the ghostly tales that surround the Stanley Hotel, none is as famous as that of room 217, the explosion that had rocked the room in 1911, injuring chambermaid Elizabeth Wilson, had left a mark that many believe persisted long after the physical damage was repaired. Elizabeth Wilson was a dedicated employee, and after her recovery from the explosion, she returned to the hotel to continue her work. But as the years went on, it seemed that her attachment to the Stanley was stronger than anyone had realized. After her passing, guests staying in room 217 began to experience odd, unexplained phenomena, things that could no longer be written off as tricks of the imagination. Visitors who stayed in the room reported feeling an unusual presence, as though someone was watching over them. It wasn't a menacing feeling, but rather a maternal, almost protective energy. Guests would wake to find their suitcases mysteriously unpacked, their clothes neatly folded, or the bed covers smoothed and tucked as if an invisible hand had been at work. Some reported waking in the middle of the night to see a woman standing at the foot of their bed, only for her to vanish as soon as they blinked. Others spoke of lights flickering on and off or hearing faint, disembodied footsteps echoing in the room when no one was around. Though unsettling, these encounters rarely felt threatening. Many who stayed in room 217 believed that the spirit of Elizabeth Wilson remained in the hotel, still dutifully tending to the needs of the guests, ensuring that their stay was as comfortable as possible, just as she had done in life. This room quickly became one of the hotel's most requested accommodations, attracting thrill seekers and ghost enthusiasts alike. For those brave enough to spend a night in room 217, the hope of encountering Elizabeth's lingering spirit was as much a draw as the luxurious surroundings. But room 217 wasn't the only place where strange things happened. In fact, the entire hotel seemed to be filled with the remnants of its past. Longtime employees and guests alike began to report a wide variety of unexplained events, turning the Stanley into a hotspot for those fascinated by the paranormal. The Grand Ballroom, once the site of many lavish parties and gatherings, became a focal point for ghostly activity. Late at night, when the ballroom was dark and empty, people claimed to hear faint music playing, as if an invisible orchestra were performing for an audience that had long since departed. Staff would hear laughter and the clinking of glasses, though no one could be seen in the room. In the hallways, guests reported hearing children's laughter and the sound of little footsteps running, though no children were staying at the hotel. This wasn't the only time ghostly children made their presence known. Visitors to the Stanley often reported seeing shadowy figures of young boys or girls darting around corners, only to disappear when approached. One of the most notable spirits said to haunt the halls of the Stanley Hotel is that of a man dressed in formal wear, often seen lingering near the hotel's bar. This figure, described as tall and distinguished, is believed to be none other than F.O. Stanley himself. Guests who've encountered him say that he offers them a nod of approval, as though still taking pride in the hotel he built, before vanishing into thin air. The presence of these spirits wasn't restricted to just the famous rooms or public spaces. Many guests reported feeling cold spots in the halls, or the sensation of being watched when they were alone. Doors would open and close by themselves. Lights would flicker, and objects would sometimes move of their own accord. Even the hotel staff, many of whom had worked there for decades, couldn't deny that something unexplainable seemed to be happening. Among the many ghost stories told about the Stanley Hotel, one of the most persistent revolves around the fourth floor. In the early days of the hotel, the fourth floor was where female employees, children, and nannies would stay. It was said to have been the site of many sleepless nights, as children would run up and down the halls, playing games and laughing. Now, the laughter of those long-gone children is said to echo through the halls once more. Guests who stay on the fourth floor often report hearing the sounds of children giggling, playing, and sometimes even crying late at night, though no children are present. The sound of small feet running along the floorboards has been heard by many, and some guests have even claimed to see the apparitions of young children darting through the shadows. But the children aren't the only ones said to haunt the fourth floor. Some guests have reported waking up in the middle of the night to find themselves tucked in bed so tightly that they could hardly move, as if someone had come to check on them while they slept. This odd and unsettling experience, though seemingly harmless, has been reported frequently enough to become a hallmark of a stay on the fourth floor. It's also not uncommon for guests to hear the faint sound of an old-fashioned elevator in use, even when the elevator itself is completely still. The creaking of doors and the rattling of chains add to the eerie atmosphere, as though the ghosts of the hotel's past are still going about their daily routines. One particularly eerie tale that has emerged from the Stanley Hotel involves an unseen entity that seems to enjoy watching the living go about their day. Guests have reported feeling an overwhelming sensation of being watched, especially when alone in their rooms or walking through the quieter parts of the hotel. One chilling story comes from a guest who stayed in one of the hotel's more remote rooms. As they lay in bed one night, they had the distinct feeling that someone or something was watching them from the corner of the room. At first, they dismissed it as their imagination playing tricks, but the feeling grew stronger, so much so that they couldn't shake the sensation of eyes upon them. When they finally worked up the courage to turn on the light and look, there was, of course, no one there. But the sensation of being watched lingered for the rest of the night, preventing them from sleeping. Such reports are common at the Stanley Hotel, with many visitors describing similar experiences. While these encounters rarely escalate beyond a feeling of unease, they contribute to the hotel's haunted reputation, as though the spirits of the Stanley's past still take an interest in the living, silently observing their every move. As the ghost stories continued to pile up, the Stanley Hotel's reputation as a haunted destination only grew. F.O. Stanley himself had passed away in 1940, but his legacy and, according to some, his presence remained strong. His vision of the Stanley as a luxurious getaway in the heart of the mountains had been realized, But now it was something more. The hotel had become a place where the past and the present seemed to blend, where the veil between the living and the dead was thin enough that, on certain nights, the two could almost touch. By the 1960s, the Stanley Hotel had gained a reputation as one of the most haunted places in the United States, drawing curious visitors eager to catch a glimpse of the otherworldly. Paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, and thrill seekers flocked to its doors, each hoping for a brush with the unknown. Little did they know, the real transformation of the Stanley Hotel's haunted reputation was still yet to come. By the 1970s, the Stanley Hotel had already established a strong reputation for being haunted. Stories of ghostly encounters and unexplained occurrences were a part of the hotel's mystique, attracting curious visitors eager to experience its strange atmosphere firsthand. However, it wasn't until a particular guest arrived in 1974 that the hotel's reputation would be cemented on the world stage. This guest was none other than Stephen King, a man whose encounter with the hotel would inspire one of the most iconic horror novels of all time, The Shining. In late 1974, Stephen King and his wife Tabitha were living in Boulder, Colorado, while King worked on a novel that wasn't progressing the way he had hoped. Seeking inspiration, they decided to take a break and headed to the mountains for a short getaway. As they drove through Estes Park, they came upon the Stanley Hotel, a grand structure perched against the backdrop of the Rockies. At the time, the hotel was nearing the end of its season, and they managed to book a room for the night room 217. Upon their arrival, they found that the Stanley Hotel was eerily quiet. The staff was preparing to close the hotel for the winter, and King and his wife were the only guests staying in the enormous building. As they explored the empty halls and vast, echoing spaces, the sense of isolation grew. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the occasional creak or distant whisper of wind through the mountains. That night, after an unsettling dinner in the cavernous dining room, King and his wife retired to room 217. While Tabitha fell asleep quickly, King found himself unable to rest. The isolation of the hotel, combined with its strange and haunting atmosphere, weighed heavily on him. As he wandered the empty corridors, his imagination began to spin stories. It was during that sleepless night that King had a vivid and terrifying dream. In it, his young son was running down the hotel's hallways, looking back over his shoulder, eyes wide with fear. Something unseen and malevolent was chasing him, and King, as a helpless bystander, watched as his son screamed and ran, unable to escape the inevitable. King woke up with his heart pounding, drenched in sweat. Shaken by the intensity of the dream, King got out of bed, lit a cigarette, and stood by the window of room 217, staring out into the dark night. As he gazed over the hotel grounds, the seed of an idea began to take shape in his mind. The isolation, the overwhelming presence of the building, and the feeling of something sinister lurking just beneath the surface. All of these elements converged in that moment, sparking the creation of The Shining. By the time King left the Stanley Hotel the next morning, the outline of the novel was clear in his mind. The story would center on a family staying in an isolated hotel, where the forces of the building itself would begin to unravel the sanity of the father, ultimately leading to horror and violence. When The Shining was published in 1977, it quickly became one of Stephen King's most celebrated works. The novel tells the story of Jack Torrance, a struggling writer who takes a job as the winter caretaker of the Overlook Hotel, a remote, eerie resort that becomes the setting for his slow descent into madness. Alongside Jack are his wife Wendy and his young son Danny, who possesses psychic abilities, or The Shining, which allows him to sense the malevolent presence within the hotel. While the Overlook Hotel in the novel was a fictional creation, it was heavily inspired by King's stay at the Stanley Hotel. The long, empty halls, the remote mountain setting, and the feeling of isolation all mirrored King's experience in Estes Park. Even Room 217 played a significant role in both the novel and the real-life hauntings, with King's night in the room serving as the spark for some of the novel's most chilling scenes. The Shining was an instant success, cementing King's reputation as one of the greatest horror writers of his generation. But more importantly for the Stanley Hotel, the book brought with it an avalanche of attention. Readers flocked to Estes Park, eager to see the hotel that had inspired the terrifying Overlook. The 1980 film adaptation of The Shining, directed by Stanley Kubrick and starring Jack Nicholson, further propelled the hotel into the public consciousness. Although the film was not shot at the Stanley Hotel, the connection to King's novel ensured that the real-life hotel became a mecca for fans of the story. Visitors wanted to experience firsthand the place that had given birth to one of horror's most iconic settings. As word of Stephen King's connection to the Stanley Hotel spread, the hotel's ghost stories began to evolve. The existing tales of hauntings, Elizabeth Wilson in Room 217, the phantom children on the 4th floor, and the shadowy figures in the hallways became intertwined with King's fictional narrative. The line between fact and fiction blurred, and visitors to the hotel often couldn't tell where the real ghost stories ended and King's horror masterpiece began. For many, the Stanley Hotel and the Overlook Hotel became one and the same. Guests would arrive at the Stanley expecting to encounter the terrifying forces described in The Shining, and the hotel's existing reputation for being haunted only added fuel to the fire. The eerie, empty halls and strange occurrences that had been reported for decades took on a new, more sinister tone in the wake of King's novel. The hotel leaned into this new identity, hosting events and tours that capitalized on its connection to The Shining. The annual Halloween Ball, ghost tours, and paranormal-themed events all drew crowds of horror fans, eager to experience the place that had inspired such fear. Even today, the hotel's ghost tours are among its most popular attractions, with visitors hoping to catch a glimpse of the paranormal. With the rise of Stephen King's fame and the increased attention on the Stanley Hotel, it wasn't long before paranormal investigators began taking a serious interest in the building. Ghost hunters, psychics, and paranormal experts flocked to the hotel, hoping to document the ghostly activity that had become so closely tied to its identity. The Stanley became a frequent feature on paranormal television shows, where investigators would spend nights in the supposedly haunted rooms, using various tools and techniques to capture evidence of spirits. Some of these investigations yielded compelling results: strange shadows captured on camera, unexplained voices recorded on audio equipment, and sudden drops in temperature in areas known for paranormal activity. Room 217, in particular, became a focal point for these investigations. Many claimed to have captured the spirit of Elizabeth Wilson on film or audio, while others reported personal experiences of objects moving, doors opening on their own, or the sensation of being touched by an invisible presence. The ballroom and the 4th floor also proved to be hotspots for paranormal activity, with investigators reporting eerie music, footsteps, and the distinct feeling of being watched. Despite the scientific equipment used, many of these occurrences remained unexplained, only adding to the allure and mystery surrounding the Stanley Hotel. As more and more people began to flock to the Stanley Hotel, drawn in by the stories of hauntings and its connection to The Shining, the hotel's reputation as a haunted location solidified. For many visitors, the ghosts of the Stanley were as real as the building itself, a part of its identity as much as its grand architecture or stunning mountain views. The interplay between Stephen King's fictional horrors and the real-life hauntings of the Stanley created a unique experience for those who visited. Some came expecting to encounter the terrifying forces described in The Shining, while others hoped for a glimpse of the real ghosts said to haunt the hotel. But for many, the distinction between the two had become irrelevant. The Stanley Hotel was a place where the past, both real and imagined, seemed to come alive, where the boundaries between the living and the dead, between fiction and reality, were paper-thin. And it was this fusion of horror fiction and paranormal history that would ensure the Stanley Hotel's place as one of the most famous haunted destinations in the world. As the Stanley Hotel's reputation grew, the building's paranormal activity became a major draw for visitors from around the world. People were no longer simply interested in the hotel's history or its grand architecture. They wanted to experience its ghosts firsthand. The rise of paranormal television shows in the early 2000s turned the Stanley Hotel into a central figure in the global fascination with the supernatural. Investigators, thrill seekers, and curious tourists flocked to the hotel in search of proof of life after death, further entwining the Stanley's fate with the world of the unexplained. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Stanley Hotel had fully embraced its reputation as a haunted destination. With Stephen King's The Shining still casting a long shadow, the demand for ghost tours and paranormal experiences grew. The hotel began offering ghost-themed tours that took visitors to the most haunted areas of the building, including Room 217, the fourth floor, the Grand Ballroom, and the basement where employees had long reported strange occurrences. These tours were filled with stories of unexplained events, objects moving on their own, doors opening and closing without cause, and guests experiencing eerie sensations. For those willing to stay overnight, the allure of possibly encountering a spirit became the main attraction. Many visitors would bring their own recording devices, hoping to capture voices or strange sounds, while others would take photos in the hope of catching a glimpse of something supernatural. Some guests reported waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of disembodied voices or the sensation of someone or something sitting on the edge of their bed. Others claimed to have seen full-bodied apparitions, including the ghostly figure of a woman in old-fashioned attire gliding silently through the halls, or children's laughter echoing faintly down the corridors. These experiences were rarely malicious, but they left a lasting impression on those who encountered them. In 2006, the Stanley Hotel reached a new level of fame when it was featured on the popular paranormal investigation show Ghost Hunters. The show's team of investigators spent several nights in the hotel, using their advanced equipment to try and document paranormal activity. Their investigation focused on several key areas: the famously haunted Room 217, the ballroom, the tunnels beneath the hotel, and the fourth floor, which had long been associated with the sounds of children's laughter and footsteps. During the investigation, the Ghost Hunters team reported several compelling pieces of evidence. In one instance, they captured a mysterious female voice in an empty room, and in another, they recorded what appeared to be the sound of children playing in a hallway, despite the fact that no children were staying at the hotel at the time. In the ballroom, they documented sudden temperature drops and strange light anomalies, as if something unseen was moving through the space. One of the most talked about moments came when one of the team members felt as though they had been touched by an invisible hand while standing in the basement. Though the sensation was fleeting, it was powerful enough to convince the investigators that the hotel's reputation was more than just legend. The Ghost Hunters episode catapulted the Stanley Hotel into the mainstream, drawing in an entirely new audience of ghost enthusiasts and paranormal fans. For many, the evidence captured during the show's investigation confirmed what they had long suspected, that the Stanley Hotel was home to something otherworldly. With its rising status as a paranormal hotspot, the Stanley Hotel began to host a series of events that catered specifically to the paranormal community. These included ghost hunting conferences, where amateur and professional investigators could gather to discuss their experiences, share evidence, and participate in investigations of the hotel. These conferences, often held over several days, featured guest speakers, including well-known paranormal experts, authors, and even psychics who claimed to have communicated with the spirits of the hotel. Attendees would be given special access to the hotel's most haunted areas, allowing them to conduct their own investigations late into the night. The hotel also began to offer paranormal workshops, where participants could learn how to use ghost hunting equipment such as electromagnetic field (EMF) meters, thermal cameras, and voice recorders. These workshops allowed even casual visitors to experience the thrill of ghost hunting, adding a layer of excitement to their stay at the Stanley. In addition to conferences, the hotel hosted special events during Halloween, its busiest time of year. The Stanley's annual Halloween ball became a highlight of the season, attracting hundreds of guests dressed in elaborate costumes, many inspired by characters from The Shining or the hotel's own ghost stories. The event featured live music, performances, and of course, ghost tours that extended late into the night, giving guests the chance to celebrate in the midst of the hotel's supposed spirits. As more people began visiting the Stanley Hotel with the express purpose of encountering the paranormal, the number of ghost stories associated with the hotel grew. Both guests and employees contributed to the ever-expanding collection of eerie tales, and many claimed to have documented their experiences. One of the most commonly reported phenomena involved unexplained noises in the hotel's hallways, particularly on the fourth floor. Guests would often hear the sound of children running and laughing late at night, only to open their doors and find the hallway empty. Some visitors even reported hearing the sound of bouncing balls, though no one could ever find the source of the noise. The Grand Ballroom, long associated with ghostly activity, also continued to be a hotspot. Many staff members claimed to have heard the faint sound of a piano playing when the room was empty. One story told of a maintenance worker who had entered the ballroom to turn off the lights, only to find a lone figure standing at the far end of the room. The figure, dressed in formal attire from another era, reportedly stared at the worker before fading away into the shadows. Room 217, thanks to its association with both Stephen King and the ghost of Elizabeth Wilson, remained the most requested room in the hotel. Guests who stayed in the room reported a variety of strange experiences, from the sensation of being watched to the inexplicable movement of objects within the room. One guest recalled waking up in the middle of the night to find their suitcase neatly unpacked with their clothes folded and placed on the bed, even though they had left everything in disarray before falling asleep. The hotel's basement and tunnels, which had been used by staff in the early days to move around the hotel unnoticed, were another area of interest for paranormal investigators. Some claim to have heard the sound of footsteps following them through the narrow tunnels, while others reported feeling sudden cold drafts or hearing whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. One of the most enduring ghost stories associated with the Stanley Hotel is that of F.O. Stanley himself. Many guests and staff members have reported seeing the hotel's founder walking through the halls, often dressed in a suit and tie as he oversees the hotel he built. His ghost is most frequently seen near the bar, where he is said to stand and watch over the guests with a calm, dignified air. Unlike some of the other spirits said to haunt the hotel, F.O. Stanley's presence is often described as comforting rather than frightening. Guests who have encountered his spirit claim that they felt reassured, as though the hotel's founder was still taking pride in his creation and ensuring that it was running smoothly. One particularly famous account came from a group of tourists who were visiting the hotel as part of a ghost tour. As they passed by the bar, one of the women in the group spotted a man sitting at the bar, dressed in formal attire. She mentioned him to the tour guide, who turned to look only to find the bar completely empty. Though these sightings are rare, they contribute to the overall sense that the Stanley Hotel is a place where the past continues to linger, where the spirits of those who helped shape its history remain tied to the building, ensuring that their legacy endures. By the mid-2000s, the Stanley Hotel had solidified its place as one of the world's most famous haunted destinations. The combination of its real-life hauntings, its connection to The Shining, and its embrace of the paranormal community ensured that the hotel would continue to attract visitors eager to experience the supernatural. From ghost tours to paranormal investigations, the Stanley offered a unique blend of history, luxury, and the chance to encounter something otherworldly. For many, a visit to the Stanley Hotel wasn't just a vacation. It was an opportunity to step into a world where the lines between the living and the dead blurred, where the echoes of the past could still be heard in the quiet moments of the night. In the present day, the Stanley Hotel stands as more than just a luxurious mountain retreat. It has evolved into a place where history, legend, and the supernatural coexist in a delicate balance, attracting visitors from all walks of life. Some come for its stunning views of the Rocky Mountains, others for the comfort of its stately rooms, but many come for the ghosts and the thrill of the unknown. Over a century after its doors first opened, the Stanley Hotel has become a living monument to its own paranormal legacy. Throughout its long history, the Stanley Hotel has undergone numerous renovations to maintain its grand appearance. However, these changes have done little to diminish the hotel's otherworldly charm. In fact, many believe that renovations may have only stirred up more paranormal activity. It's a common belief among ghost hunters and psychics that when buildings are disrupted, so too are the spirits that dwell within them. The Stanley's ongoing efforts to update its facilities have been met with increased reports of strange occurrences. One of the most significant renovations came in the early 2010s, when the Stanley underwent a major refurbishment to restore its historical grandeur while adding modern amenities. During this process, construction workers reported seeing figures out of the corners of their eyes, only to find no one there upon closer inspection. Tools would go missing, only to reappear in strange places. Some workers even claimed to have heard their names whispered when they were alone in empty rooms. Even after these updates, the Stanley remained committed to its haunted reputation. In 2015, the hotel announced plans to build a state-of-the-art film center and horror museum dedicated to the genre that had cemented the hotel's place in popular culture. Although the project has faced delays and setbacks, the idea of a permanent tribute to horror, and particularly to The Shining, speaks to the way the Stanley has embraced its identity as a haunted landmark. The museum's vision includes memorabilia from iconic horror films, exhibitions about the history of the genre, and even a space for paranormal investigations. This venture represents a bold step forward for the Stanley, cementing its place not just as a historical site, but as a cultural destination for horror fans and ghost enthusiasts alike. Decades after its release, Stephen King's The Shining continues to loom large over the Stanley Hotel. Visitors come from all over the world, drawn by the connection to King's novel and Stanley Kubrick's 1980 film adaptation. While Kubrick's version of The Shining was filmed elsewhere, the Stanley Hotel remains the spiritual home of the Overlook Hotel in the minds of many fans. The hotel has fully embraced this legacy, offering special events and tours that focus on its connection to the novel. Fans of King's work can book stays in room 217, the room where King himself stayed and the setting of a pivotal moment in the novel. The hotel also offers a Shining-themed tour, where guests are taken to the locations that inspired key moments in the story. Guides share behind-the-scenes insights into King's visit, as well as the ways the real-life hotel differs from the fictional Overlook. However, the Stanley Hotel has made an effort to distinguish itself from the darker elements of The Shining. While the Overlook in King's novel is a place of malevolent spirits and madness, the Stanley's ghosts are typically described as playful or mischievous, rather than evil. The hotel prides itself on being a place where guests can experience the thrill of the supernatural without the terror that accompanies the Overlook. This careful balance between embracing its fictional legacy and maintaining its own identity has helped the Stanley attract both casual visitors and die-hard fans of King's work. It's a delicate line to walk. But the hotel has managed to carve out a unique space for itself in the world of horror and the paranormal. In recent years, the Stanley Hotel has become a popular destination for couples seeking an unconventional wedding venue. The combination of luxury and the supernatural offers a unique backdrop for those looking to tie the knot. Wedding ceremonies are often held on the hotel's sprawling grounds, with the majestic Rocky Mountains providing a breathtaking view. However, it's the haunted reputation of the hotel that often becomes a memorable part of these events. Many couples choose to embrace the hotel's ghostly charm, incorporating it into their wedding themes. Some brides and grooms have even reported unexplained phenomena during their ceremonies or receptions, objects moving on their own, strange cold spots in the ballroom, or fleeting figures captured in wedding photos. For those fascinated by the paranormal, these occurrences add an unforgettable layer to their special day. In addition to weddings, the Stanley Hotel hosts a variety of events throughout the year that cater to its ghostly allure. From Halloween parties to murder mystery dinners, these events draw in crowds eager to experience the hotel's eerie atmosphere. The Stanley's annual Halloween Ball is a particularly popular event, with guests dressing in elaborate costumes and partaking in ghost tours and paranormal-themed activities. It's a night where the veil between the living and the supernatural seems especially thin, and many attendees leave with their own stories of unexplained encounters. Despite the wealth of ghost stories that surround the Stanley Hotel, not everyone is convinced that the hotel is truly haunted. Some skeptics argue that the hotel's reputation is built on folklore and the power of suggestion. They claim that visitors who come to the Stanley expecting to experience paranormal activity are more likely to interpret everyday occurrences, such as creaky floorboards or sudden drafts, as ghostly phenomena. Skeptics point to the fact that many of the hotel's ghost stories have no clear historical basis. For example, there's little documented evidence to suggest that Elizabeth Wilson, the chambermaid associated with room 217, actually haunts the hotel. Similarly, the stories of children's laughter on the fourth floor and ghostly figures in the ballroom often lack concrete evidence to support their claims. However, for every skeptic, there is a believer who insists that the Stanley Hotel is indeed haunted. These believers often point to their own personal experiences as proof. They speak of feelings of being watched, objects moving on their own, or sudden, unexplained cold spots. Some even claim to have captured photographic evidence of spirits' blurry figures, orbs of light, or shadowy shapes that appear in their photos without explanation. For many, the truth about the Stanley Hotel lies somewhere in between. Whether or not the hotel is genuinely haunted, there is no denying the power of its reputation. The stories that have accumulated over the years have taken on a life of their own, becoming an integral part of the hotel's identity. Beyond its haunted reputation, the Stanley Hotel has found a place in popular culture. In addition to its connection to The Shining, the hotel has been featured in numerous television shows, documentaries, and films. Its grand architecture and eerie history make it a compelling location for filmmakers and storytellers alike. The hotel has been featured on paranormal investigation shows such as Ghost Adventures, Most Haunted, and Paranormal Witness, with investigators attempting to capture evidence of the spirits that are said to roam its halls. These shows have only added to the Stanley's mystique, drawing in fans of the paranormal who are eager to see the hotel for themselves. In addition to television, the Stanley Hotel has inspired countless books, articles, and online content. From ghost hunting blogs to fan fiction inspired by The Shining, the hotel continues to capture the imaginations of people around the world. Its unique blend of history, horror, and the supernatural ensures that it will remain a subject of fascination for years to come. As the Stanley Hotel moves into its second century, it remains one of the most famous haunted locations in the world. For some, it is a place of luxury and relaxation, a beautiful retreat nestled in the Rocky Mountains. For others, it is a place of mystery and intrigue, where the past continues to echo through the halls, and the spirits of those long gone still make their presence known. Whether visitors come for the ghost stories, the stunning views, or the connection to The Shining, the Stanley Hotel offers an experience unlike any other. It is a place where history and the supernatural converge, creating a unique atmosphere that leaves a lasting impression on all who visit. For over a century, the Stanley Hotel has stood as a testament to the power of storytelling, and its legacy will continue to grow, fueled by the whispers of ghosts and the thrill of the unknown. And for those brave enough to spend the night, the Stanley Hotel offers a simple challenge. Do you believe?